The train pulled out of Caldwell Creek at 3 minutes past noon on a Thursday in October of 1891, and it left behind a cloud of coal smoke and the particular kind of silence that only settles over a town when something has happened that no one quite knows how to talk about yet. Evelyn Harper stood on the platform and did not move. She had been standing in one place for so long that her legs had gone partly numb, which was fine, because she wasn't sure she trusted them to carry her forward anyway. The letter was still in her hand. She had been gripping it for the better part of 6 hours, ever since she'd boarded in Cheyenne, and her fingers had gone stiff around it. She didn't open it. She already knew what it said. She had written it herself nearly 4 years ago in a room she had not been permitted to leave. On paper, she had begged a kitchen maid to smuggle in for her. She had not known, when she wrote it, whether it would ever reach anyone. Apparently it hadn't. That was all right. She was here now. She looked at the boy. He was still staring at her, had not moved since he'd said those words, since he'd pressed his face against her and then pulled back to look up at her with dark eyes that she recognized the way you recognize a landmark you thought you might never see again. He was taller than she remembered. Of course he was. 4 years was a long time for a child. He had been barely 2 when she last held him, and the version of him that lived in her memory was something small and round-faced and smelling of milk and cedar soap. This boy was 5. Nearly 6, she calculated. He had knees that were scuffed through the denim of his trousers and a smear of something, jam, probably, or motor grease, across the back of his left hand. He looked at her with his father's wariness and her own set to his jaw, and she felt something in her chest rearrange itself like furniture being moved in a room that had been dark for a very long time. "Caleb," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. He nodded, like he was confirming something. "You remember me?" She hadn't meant it to come out as a question. It came out as a question. "No," he said, honest as a blade. "But I know your face." Before she could work out what to say to that, a hand came down on the boy's shoulder. A large hand, calloused, with a scar across the knuckle of the index finger that she had kissed once, on a cold morning a long time ago. And she looked up. Silas Boone had not aged the way she expected. She had expected him to look harder. She had expected bitterness to have carved itself into the lines of his face the way it did with some men, the way grief could turn a person to stone. Instead, he just looked tired. Tired and wary and very, very still. The way a man goes still when he is working hard not to let his face tell the truth about what is happening inside him. He stared at her. She stared back. Around them, the people of Caldwell Creek did what small-town people always do when something uncomfortable is happening in their midst. They pretended to be doing other things while making absolutely sure they didn't miss a single moment of it. Martha Greer had found a sudden urgent need to rearrange the display in her shop window directly across the street. 2 men she didn't recognize had stopped in the middle of unloading a wagon and were holding perfectly still with their arms full of crates and their eyes fixed on the platform. Old Hector Daniels, who ran the feed store and had known Silas since before Caleb was born, had simply stopped walking and stood in the middle of the road with his hat in his hands. Nobody said anything. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Evelyn." Not a greeting, not a question, just her name, spoken the way you might name a thing you've pulled out of a box you thought you'd buried. "Silas," she said. Another silence. "You're wearing a wedding dress," he said. "I know. It's—" He stopped. "Torn. I know that too." Caleb looked from one of them to the other like he was watching something he didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. Then he looked up at his father and said, "Papa, is she staying?" Silas did not answer that immediately. He was looking at Evelyn's hands, at the letter specifically, which she was still holding like she was afraid it might dissolve if she let go of it. "Where did you come from?" he said. "East," she said. "Far east." "I came by train." "I can see you came by train. That's not what I asked." She held his gaze. "I know what you asked." He waited. She said, "I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you all of it, but I'd rather not do it standing on this platform with half the town watching." His jaw tightened. She could see him working through it, the anger and the confusion, and underneath those the thing she couldn't quite read yet, the thing that might have been hope or might have been something much more dangerous than hope. "Fine," he said at last. He put his hand back on Caleb's shoulder. Let's go. Yeah, she had been in love with Silas Boone before she understood what love was supposed to feel like, which meant she had built it out of imperfect materials and was always slightly surprised when it held. She had met him in the spring of 1886 when she was 22, and her father had brought her to Wyoming to look at a tract of land he was considering purchasing. Harold Harper was not a man who took his daughter along on business unless there was a specific reason for it, and Evelyn had learned by that point to be careful when her father had reasons. The reason, it turned out, was that Silas Boone owned the adjacent property, and Harold had wanted an opportunity to assess the man, his circumstances, his ambition, his debt, his weaknesses. And he had thought correctly that Evelyn was useful for getting men to let their guard down. She was not beautiful in the way her father found useful, which meant she was not a distraction. She was pleasant-faced and quiet, and asked questions that made people feel intelligent for answering them. And Harold had discovered over the years that this made her an extremely effective instrument for gathering information about other people while revealing nothing about herself. What Harold had not accounted for was that Silas Boone was not the kind of man who let his guard down easily, and that Evelyn would find this, the challenge of it, the steadiness underneath it, the way he spoke plainly and did not perform, interesting in a way she had not been prepared for. They talked for 3 hours that first afternoon while Harold inspected the land with Silas's foreman. They talked about the ranch, about cattle, about the particular quality of Wyoming winters that nobody who hadn't lived through one could really describe properly. They talked about what it meant to build something in a place that would just as soon kill you as let you prosper. Silas was 30 then, and he had already failed twice and rebuilt once, and he had a way of speaking about failure that Evelyn had never encountered before, not with shame and not with bravado, just with the matter-of-fact acknowledgement that failure was part of the landscape, and you had to know its terrain as well as you knew anything else. She thought about that conversation for weeks afterward. She thought about it all the way back to Philadelphia, where Harold had a house and business interests, and a daughter he was beginning to realize he needed to find a specific use for before she became an inconvenience. She wrote to Silas first. She was not sure afterward what exactly possessed her to do it. It was not the kind of thing she had ever done before, and she was aware that it was forward in a way that a woman in her position was not supposed to be. She wrote anyway. She said she had thought about what he'd said about the winter, and that she had a question she'd forgotten to ask. He wrote back 3 weeks later. 1 page, cramped and economical, like he was charging himself for the ink. He answered her question and asked one of his own. She answered. He answered. By winter they had exchanged 15 letters, and Harold had noticed, and Harold was beginning to have opinions. She went back to Wyoming in February of 1887, ostensibly because her father had unresolved business in the territory, actually because she had been invited to visit the ranch, and she had said yes before she fully thought through the implications. The visit lasted a week. On the 4th day, Silas asked if she would consider staying, and she had said, "You'll have to ask me properly." And he had said, "I'm asking you properly." And she had said, "No, you're asking me like you're inquiring about weather conditions." And he had gone quiet for a moment and then said, "Will you marry me?" Not as a question exactly, more as a statement of what he wanted, and she had said yes. Harold was furious. That was, she understood later, the beginning of everything that followed. The Boone Ranch sat 4 miles outside of Caldwell Creek, on land that Silas had broken himself over the course of 7 years. It was not a comfortable place by any definition she had grown up with. The house was 2 stories of rough-cut timber and plaster, practical and unlovely, with a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side and a roof that had been partially replaced after the storm of '89 and still showed the seam between old shingles and new. She had loved it from the first moment she saw it. She had told Silas that once, and he had looked at her like he was trying to determine whether she was sincere or performing sincerity. Most women in your position, he'd said, would not consider this adequate. "I'm not most women in my position," she had said. He had looked at her a while longer and said, "No, I don't think you are." Now she sat at the kitchen table that she had sat at as a new bride and watched Silas move around the room, making coffee that neither of them was going to enjoy, and she thought about how strange it was that the table was exactly the same nick in the left corner where something heavy had been set down too hard. The same ring-shaped stain near the far edge that she had never been able to identify the origin of, and how different everything else was. Caleb had been sent outside. She had not missed the way the boy lingered in the doorway before he went, looking between them with that careful attention that children develop when they've learned that adult conversations can matter in ways that aren't immediately obvious. "Coffee," Silas said. He set a cup in front of her. It was not offered warmly. "Thank you." He sat down across from her. He put his own cup on the table and didn't touch it. 4 years, he said. "Yes. Evelyn, I need you to explain to me." He stopped, started again. "I need you to tell me what happened, all of it, because what I know is that you left. 3 months after Caleb was born, you were gone. No note, no word, nothing. And then I get a letter 6 months later, through a lawyer in Philadelphia, telling me that you want a legal separation and you don't intend to return." He looked at her steadily. "Those are the facts as I know them. So I need to understand what you think the facts are." Evelyn set the letter on the table between them. "I didn't write that letter," she said. "The one from the lawyer. I didn't write it, and I didn't authorize it, and I didn't know it had been sent until much later." Silas looked at the letter she'd placed between them. Her letter. The one she'd written 4 years ago in a locked room. Then he looked at her. "And the leaving? You didn't authorize that either?" "No, I didn't leave." She kept her voice flat and steady because if she let any feeling into it, she was going to lose the thread entirely, and she needed to keep the thread. "I was taken." He stared at her. "Silas, listen to me. I know what it looks like. I know what you've been told, and I know that everything you've been told has pointed in one direction, but I need you to hear me out before you decide anything." A long silence. "Talk," he said. So she talked. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She told him about the morning, still cold, Caleb barely 3 months old, her still worn to the bone from the birth. When 2 men had arrived at the ranch while Silas was out checking the south fence line. She had thought they were traitors. She had opened the door. One of them had held something under her nose, cloth soaked in something chemical. And when she woke up, she was in the back of a closed wagon, her hands tied, heading east. She told him about Philadelphia, about the house on Chestnut Street, her father's house, though she had not lived there in years, and the room on the second floor where she had been kept. Not a prison exactly, by Harold Harper's accounting. He had brought her books. He had allowed her to walk in the garden twice a week with an escort. He had sent a doctor to see to her physical well-being and had explained to that doctor that she was suffering from a nervous condition that made her prone to episodes of irrational behavior and required careful management. She told him about the marriage Harold had arranged. A man named Reginald Voss, 53 years old, associate of Harold's, a man of significant financial and political connections in the city. Harold had been working toward this particular arrangement for years, she understood later. Had been working toward it since before she'd ever gone to Wyoming, had seen Silas Boone and the frontier as temporary distractions that he'd allowed to go too far and needed to correct. He was protecting an investment, she said. That's what I was to him. Not a daughter. An asset. Silas hadn't moved in a long time. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had on the platform. Careful, closed, revealing nothing. "The marriage to Voss," she continued. "It happened in October of 1888. There was nothing I could do to stop it. I refused twice, formally, in front of witnesses. Both times Harold had me declared mentally incompetent on the spot. He had a physician who would say whatever he paid him to say, and the ceremony proceeded over my objection." She looked down at her hands, at the ring finger of her left hand, where there was no ring, just a faint indentation in the skin that would take months to disappear. "I was his wife for 3 years. In name." "What does in name mean?" She looked up. "It means what you think it means." Something moved across his face. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table. "Voss died in August," she said. "A riding accident. He'd had too much to drink and his horse threw him." She paused. "I was not sorry." "And Harper?" "My father panicked. With Voss gone, the arrangement collapsed. The financial structure that Voss and Harold had built together. The one I was meant to anchor. He had a period of several weeks where he was trying to manage the fallout, and during that time his control over me was less coordinated." She reached out and touched the letter between them. I had had this for 4 years. I wrote it the winter after I was taken. A kitchen maid named Clara helped me get it out. I didn't know, for a long time, whether she'd succeeded. She looked at him. She had. Partway. It got as far as Cheyenne, and then it stopped. The postal clerk there was a friend of Harold's. I found that out later. The letter sat in a drawer in Cheyenne for 4 years. How did you get it back? The clerk retired in September. His replacement found it in the drawer when he was organizing the office and sent it on. She almost smiled, but not quite. 4 years in a drawer and it still got here. It got here, Silas said, a week after you did. She nodded. I didn't know that when I left. I just knew that Voss was dead and Harold was distracted and there was a window, so I went through it. She didn't describe the details of the escape. Not yet. She wasn't ready and she didn't think he was ready to hear it. There had been a window, literally, and a 3-story drop that she still had a healing bruise from on her left hip, and a road in the dark, and Clara with a horse she was not supposed to have, and a journey east to west that had taken 18 days and every cent of money that Clara had saved over 7 years of kitchen work. She would repay Clara. She had promised that, and she intended to keep it. The dress, Silas said. She looked down at herself. She had forgotten she was still wearing it. It was what I was wearing when I ran. There wasn't time to change. He married you in a wedding dress and you ran in it. It seemed appropriate. He stood up, walked to the window that looked out over the yard where she could see Caleb sitting on the fence rail that bordered the corral, watching a brown horse pace the perimeter with focused attention. The boy was talking to the horse. She couldn't hear what he was saying. I don't know what to do with this, Silas said. I know. Evelyn, He stopped. His hand was on the window frame and his knuckles were white. I spent 4 years believing you left, believing you made a choice to leave me and to leave him. I know. I told Caleb his mother was gone. I told him you weren't coming back. What did you tell him about why? A long silence. I told him it wasn't his fault, Silas said very quietly. That was the most important thing, that whatever happened, it wasn't his fault. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment, steadied herself. Thank you, she said. He turned around. His face was not angry anymore, exactly. It was something more complicated than anger. Don't thank me for that. I wasn't doing it for you. I know. I'm thanking you anyway. He didn't believe her completely. She could tell. She had not expected him to. Would have been suspicious, actually, if he had, because a man who believed everything he was told after everything that had happened to him was a man who hadn't been paying attention. What she had was the beginning of something. A crack in the wall. She asked to stay. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to say no. The barn, he finally said. There's a room in the east corner. It's small. It's cold. That's fine. I'm not making you any promises, Evelyn. I'm not asking for promises. He looked at her like he was trying to verify that she meant it. You're asking for a chance. Yes. Another silence. 1 week, he said. After a week, we'll talk again. She said that was fair. She had learned a great deal about endurance over the past 4 years, which meant she knew the difference between endurance that preserved you and endurance that destroyed you while you weren't looking. In Harold Harper's house, she had endured the second kind, had gone inward and smaller and quieter until she was barely visible to herself. She had done it because there was nothing else to do. Here there was something else to do, and she did it. She was up before dawn the next morning. She found work clothes in the barn, men's trousers and a flannel shirt that were clearly spare spares belonging to one of the ranch hands. And she changed out of the ruined dress with a sense of relief so physical it almost hurt. She bundled the dress and put it in the corner and did not look at it again. The ranch hand she encountered first, coming around the side of the barn at first light, was a young man named Pete, who was approximately 19 years old and not sophisticated enough yet to conceal his shock. Ma'am, he said, stopping so abruptly he nearly tripped. We heard, are you... I'm Evelyn Boone, she said. I'm staying for a while. What needs to be done first? He stared at her. Pete, she said. What needs to be done first? The north fence line has a section that came down in the wind 2 nights ago. Mr. Boone was going to get to it today, but he's got cattle to move in the south pasture, and I'll take the fence, she said. Show me where the tools are. But she did not know how to repair a fence properly. She knew the general principle, and she had watched it done once, years ago. And she was willing to work through the parts she didn't know, because working through the parts she didn't know was, at this point, the closest thing she had to a plan. The wind off the northern range was something else. A cold that came in sideways and found every gap between fabric and skin and made itself at home there. Her hands were wrong for this kind of work. She had spent 4 years in a house, and her hands showed it. The wire cut her twice before she got the rhythm of it, and by midday her palms were bleeding through the work gloves she'd found in the barn. She kept going. She was still at it when Caleb appeared. He came around the end of the fence line the way he approached most things she would learn. Quietly, with observation preceding engagement, like he was making sure of the terrain before committing to it. He stood about 10 feet away and watched her work. Papa says you're not supposed to do that, he said. She paused, wire in hand. He says I'm not supposed to fix the fence? He says women shouldn't do that kind of work. She considered how to respond to this carefully. What do you think? Caleb looked at the fence, looked at her. I think the fence is getting fixed. That's right. He came closer, stood beside her, and watched the way she was doing it. You're doing it wrong, he said. She looked at what she was holding. How should I do it? Here! He came right up beside her and adjusted the tension on the wire with small, competent hands that clearly had done this before. She watched and adjusted accordingly. There, he said. That way it doesn't pull loose again. Where did you learn that? She asked. Papa, he said, and Pete. Mostly Pete. Papa's way is better, but Pete explains it better. She almost smiled. What's your way? He considered this seriously. I'm still working it out, he said. They worked side by side for another 20 minutes without speaking much. She was conscious of him in a way that was difficult to describe. Some awareness that was not quite thought, the way you're conscious of a source of warmth when you are very cold. He was right there. This child who had been a grief for 4 years, an absence so large she had built the interior of her imprisonment around trying not to look at it. He was right here, telling her she was doing the fence wrong and showing her the correct technique with complete matter-of-fact competence. You really are my mama, he said at one point. It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. I am. He nodded, the same way he'd nodded on the platform, like this was information he had already filed and was now confirming. You were gone a long time, he said. I was. She looked at him. I'm sorry for that. I need you to know that I'm very sorry. He appeared to think about this. Papa was sad, he said, for a really long time. He didn't say so, but I could tell. I know. Are you sad? She thought about the accurate answer to this question. I'm working on it, she said. He seemed to find this acceptable. He nodded again and went back to the fence. The town had opinions about her return. The town had opinions about everything, but this was the kind of thing that really sharpened the town's opinion-forming capabilities. She discovered this on her second day when she drove the wagon into Caldwell Creek to get supplies that the ranch needed and that she had volunteered to collect, mostly because any task that gave her forward momentum felt essential right now. The first person to speak directly to her was Martha Greer, from the doorway of the shop whose window she had been rearranging obsessively the day before. Mrs. Boone, Martha said. She said it with the particular neutrality that meant the opposite of neutral. Mrs. Greer, Evelyn said. We didn't expect to see you back. I imagine not. Most people in town thought, well, Martha smoothed her apron. We thought you'd made your choice. Evelyn stood on the boardwalk outside the general store and looked at Martha Greer, who was a woman she had known briefly but not well during the 2 years she'd lived here before, and said, I didn't make a choice. I was taken. I intend to explain that to anyone who's interested in hearing it, and I understand that some people won't be interested in hearing it, and that's all right too. I'm not here to convince anyone of anything right now. I'm here to buy flour and lamp oil and get back to the ranch. Martha blinked. I see, she said. Do you have flour? Martha straightened slightly. I do. Then let's start there. It was not a warm encounter. It was not meant to be. Evelyn was not in Caldwell Creek to be liked, not right now. She was here to work and to be present and to gradually, day by day, give the town something other than absence and scandal to associate with her name. She had learned in Philadelphia that the only power she consistently had was the power of her own behavior, and she intended to use it. The flour was fine. The lamp oil was fine. The looks she got from the two men outside the livery stable were not warm, but were not overtly hostile either. More the look you give a wounded animal you're not sure whether to approach. She could work with that. Old Hector Daniels stopped her on her way back to the wagon. He was the man she'd noticed standing in the road the day before, hat in hand, watching the platform. "Mrs. Boone," he said. He had the decency to look at her directly. "Mr. Daniels, how's the boy?" She looked at him. "He's well," she said. "He showed me how to fix fence yesterday." Something shifted in Hector's weathered face, a fractional softening. "That sounds like Caleb," he said. "That boy can fix near anything if you give him 10 minutes to study on it." "He gets that from his father, I expect." Hector looked at her for a moment. "Silas has had a hard 4 years," he said. I'm not saying it to be unkind, I just want you to understand." "I know," she said. "I intend to earn what I'm asking for, not ask for it and then wait." Hector studied her face. "Good," he said after a moment. "That's good." He moved aside and let her pass. Okay. On the third night, she sat on the floor of the small room in the east corner of the barn. There was a cot, and it was narrow, and she had 2 blankets that were adequate but not generous. And she looked at the letter in the light of a small oil lamp and thought about the 4 years between when she had written it and right now. She had spent a great deal of the past 4 years not thinking about what she was missing, because thinking about it too directly had a way of making her go to pieces, and she could not afford to go to pieces. She had thought about Caleb in brief, careful intervals, the way you allow yourself only as much sunlight as you can stand. She had thought about Silas less, or told herself she did. The truth was she had thought about him constantly, in the background of everything. The way you hear a sound you've stopped consciously registering but that your body still responds to. She thought about what he had said. I told him it wasn't his fault. She had been alone in that house for 4 years, and the thing that had most kept her functional was the knowledge that somewhere out west, a man she loved was telling her son something true and necessary and protective. It was the only thing Harold hadn't taken. He couldn't take what Silas had already done. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. From outside came the sound of the wind off the range, and the distant low sound of cattle, and something she had not heard in 4 years. Silence that was made of space rather than of walls. She lay down on the narrow cot and pulled the blankets up and listened to the space around her and thought, I'm here. I made it. I am here. It wasn't much, but it was enough to sleep on. By the end of the first week, she had repaired the north fence line, helped Pete reshoe 2 horses that he was behind on, reorganized the tack room in a way that Pete said made absolutely no sense, but then conceded was actually better, hauled firewood for 4 consecutive mornings, and read Caleb a bedtime story 3 times, an arrangement Silas had allowed cautiously, standing in the doorway the first night, and then not appearing for the second and third. She didn't ask Silas where he was during those evenings. She suspected he was somewhere in the house, within earshot, listening to what she said to his son. That was fine. She would have done the same. Caleb's bedtime story selections were idiosyncratic and revealing. He liked stories where things broke and got fixed. He liked stories where people were lost and then found. He did not like stories where everything was perfect from the beginning. That's boring, he said with complete conviction, and she thought, you are so much like your father, it is almost unfair. On the 7th night, after Caleb was asleep, Silas was in the kitchen when she came through to go back to the barn. Stay, he said. Just the one word. She stopped. I'm not ready to give you what you want, he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the same worn surface they'd sat across from each other a week ago. I don't know if I ever will be. I don't know if I can trust you enough for that. He paused. But I watched you this week, and I watched Caleb this week, and I don't think... He stopped, pressed his hand flat on the table. I don't think you're lying. She exhaled slowly. I want to talk to the lawyer in Cheyenne, he said. I want to find out if what you're telling me about the separation letter, about Harper, about Voss, if any of that can be verified." "It can," she said. "I'll tell you everything you need to find out." "All right." He looked up at her. His face was still guarded, still careful. "You can have the room off the kitchen. It's warmer than the barn." She nodded. "Thank you. It's not—" He stopped again, seemed to decide to leave the sentence unfinished. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Silas." She lay in the room off the kitchen that night with the sounds of the house around her. The creak of the structure settling in the cold, the sound of Caleb's occasional sleep mumble from upstairs, the particular silence of a house with people in it, and she thought that she had a long way yet to go. But she was inside now, and the door was still open. The room off the kitchen was not a comfortable room. It was narrow as a ship's berth, with a single window that looked out onto the side yard and let in a draft that no amount of rags stuffed along the frame could fully stop. The bed was a spare, a rope-strung frame with a mattress that had been folded and stored long enough to have developed a permanent crease down the center. There was a wooden chair, a small table, and a hook on the wall where Evelyn hung the few things she'd arrived with, which was not many things. She did not complain about any of it. She was aware, in a way she had not been 4 years ago, of exactly how much worse a room could be. She had lived in Harold Harper's house in Philadelphia, which was by any exterior measure a beautiful house. High ceilings, plaster moldings, carpets imported from Turkey, a garden that a man named Flores tended with professional devotion. She had lived in a room in that house that had a 4-poster bed and a writing desk and curtains made of Chinese silk and a lock on the door that could only be opened from the outside. She had learned that comfort and imprisonment were not mutually exclusive. She had learned that a silk curtain was worth exactly nothing if you couldn't choose whether or not to open it. The narrow room with the drafty window and the creased mattress had no lock on the door. She slept better in it than she had slept in 4 years. The rhythm of the ranch asserted itself over her quickly, the way physical work always does. Not through conscious choice, but through the simple insistence of tasks that needed doing and a body that needed something to do. She was up before the sky properly lightened. She dressed in the work clothes she'd appropriated from the barn, because she still had only the ruined dress, and she was not ready to ask Silas for anything more than he'd already given her. She made coffee first, because the ranch ran on coffee, and whoever made it first set the tone for the morning, and she had discovered that this was a small thing that mattered. Silas came in from the morning check at 6:30. He stopped when he smelled coffee, the way she'd noticed he always stopped at certain things. A little physical hesitation, like his body recognized something before his mind had decided how to receive it. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He poured a cup and stood at the counter drinking it and looking out the window over the yard. She sat at the table with her own cup and did not try to fill the silence. That was how most of their mornings went at first. Not unfriendly, not warm either. Something provisional, like a truce that both parties were observing carefully to see if the other would honor it. Caleb was what changed the temperature of the house. Not intentionally, Caleb did not scheme and was not strategic in the way some children learn to be when they understood their parents' conflict. He was simply himself, which was apparently enough. He had decided in the way he decided most things, quietly, with limited visible process, and then with complete commitment, that Evelyn was his mother, and that this was a fixed fact around which other things could arrange themselves. He asked her questions at breakfast. He waited for her after school, which she discovered when she came around the barn on the 3rd Tuesday and found him sitting on the fence with a reader open on his lap that he was clearly not reading. "You're supposed to be inside," she said. "I'm reading," he said. "You're watching the road." He looked at the book. "It's a boring part," he said. She sat on the fence beside him. "What's it about?" He handed it to her. It was a primer, well worn, with handwriting in the margins in 2 different sizes. One she recognized as Silas's economical cramped hand, and one that was smaller and rounder, that must be Caleb's own. "What's this?" she said, pointing to a margin note. "Papa writes things he wants me to remember," Caleb said. "I write back." She looked at the exchange in the margins. Silas's note beside a passage about the seasons, and Caleb's response below it in his careful child's hand. The note said, "Which season do you like best and why?" The response, in the round letters, "Winter. because you can see all the tracks in the snow and know what went past. She stared at that for a moment longer than she meant to. That's a good answer, she said when she could. I know, Caleb said without particular pride, just as a fact. She handed the book back to him. He took it and went back to watching the road, and she sat beside him and watched it too, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most comfortable she had felt since she arrived. Dumbs. Silas sent a letter to the lawyer in Cheyenne in the second week. She knew because she saw him writing it at the kitchen table late on a Wednesday evening when she came in for a glass of water, and he didn't cover it or stop writing, just acknowledged her with a glance and kept working. She did not ask what it said. She had told him everything she could tell him, and now there was a period of verification that she had to simply wait through, and waiting was something she had significant experience with. What she had not expected was that the town would form an opinion faster than the lawyer in Cheyenne. It wasn't a unified opinion. Caldwell Creek was not the kind of community that was ever unified about much. It was a frontier town, which meant it was built out of people who had mostly come from somewhere else, and were therefore accustomed to the idea that not everyone had the same story. But there were factions, the way there always were, and the factions had views. Martha Greer turned out to be complicated, which Evelyn had not initially anticipated. She had taken Martha for straightforwardly disapproving, which Martha was initially, but on her third trip to the general store, Martha came around from behind the counter when no one else was in the shop and said, without preamble, "My sister was in a situation. Not exactly like yours, but not entirely unlike yours either. Her husband's family. They had ways of making things happen." She paused. "I'm not saying I believe everything you've said, but I'm not saying I disbelieve it either." Evelyn looked at her. "That's fair. What I'm saying is," Martha seemed to be working out the words, "I'm going to wait and see. That's all. Not everyone in this town is willing to do that, but I am." "I appreciate it," Evelyn said. Martha nodded briskly and went back behind the counter, and the subject was closed, and the next time Evelyn came in, Martha talked to her the way she talked to other customers. Not warmly, but normally, which was a significant upgrade. The less generous faction was represented in its most vocal form by a man named Douglas Hale, who ran the small law office that handled most of the county's property disputes and had been, she gathered, something of an informal advisor to Silas in her absence. She encountered Douglas Hale on a Friday afternoon when she was crossing the street near the post office, and he stepped into her path, not quite deliberately or in a way that could be called deliberate if challenged, but deliberately enough. "Mrs. Boone," he said. He said the name with a particular inflection that made clear he had doubts about whether it was properly hers. "Mr. Hale," she said. She had asked Pete about the faces in town and had matching names to most of them by now. "Quite the return," he said. "I suppose so." He looked her over in the way that certain men did when they wanted you to know they were assessing you and didn't mind being seen doing it. "Silas is a good man," he said. "He's had a difficult road. I'd hate to see anyone take advantage of that." "So would I," she said pleasantly. He seemed to not quite know what to do with that response. He'd been expecting perhaps defensiveness or apology. She gave him neither. "The things you're claiming," he said, "about your father, about where you've been." "Yes?" "They're fairly extraordinary claims." "They are," she agreed. "I have documentation for most of them. When the lawyer in Cheyenne responds to Silas's inquiry, I expect that will become clearer." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know about the letter to Cheyenne?" "I knew Silas would verify what I told him. I encouraged him to." She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking anyone to take me on faith, Mr. Hale. I'm asking for the opportunity to demonstrate what happened. That's all." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped aside. Not warmly, but he stepped aside. She walked past him and thought, that one is going to be a problem, and filed that away. It was Caleb who first told her about the dreams. She had been at the ranch for nearly 3 weeks, and she was reading to him, a story about a man who got lost in the mountains and had to find his way home by following the river. When he interrupted her mid-sentence and said, "I used to dream about a lady," she stopped reading, kept her face neutral. "What kind of lady?" "She smelled like lavender," he said. He said it like it was mildly interesting information rather than something he'd been carrying for a long time. "And she sang. Not very well, but she sang. Evelyn's throat closed. She had sung to him when he was a baby. Not well. She had never had a good voice and had known it and sang to him anyway in the dark of early morning when he was fussy and the world was quiet and it was just the two of them, and it didn't matter whether she could carry a tune. She had sung him pieces of songs she half remembered from her own childhood, stitched together without much regard for whether they belonged to each other. "Do you still dream about her?" she managed. Caleb thought about this with his usual deliberateness. "Not as much," he said. "She used to come a lot when I was little. Papa said it was because I missed you." He paused. He didn't say it like that, but that's what he meant. She looked at the book in her hands, at the page with the lost man in the river. "What did he say?" "He said some people leave holes when they go," Caleb said, "and sometimes your brain tries to fill them in at night because it doesn't know how to leave them empty." She looked at her son, who was 5 years old and delivered his father's inadvertent poetry without any apparent awareness of its weight, and thought that 4 years ago she had been holding this child and thinking he was the most complete thing she had ever known, and she had been right, and here he was still, complete in an entirely different way, in a way she hadn't known to expect. "Do you think I'm the lady from the dream?" he asked, genuinely curious, not testing her. "Do you?" He considered. "The smell is the same," he said. "It's in your coat." She had, without thinking about it, kept a small bundle of dried lavender in her coat pocket for years, a habit from before, from the Wyoming house, where she had grown it in a window box. She had taken a bundle with her when Harold's men had taken her, stuffed into the pocket of the coat she'd been wearing, and she had kept it through the years in Philadelphia as a kind of stubbornness, replacing it when it dried out, because it was something Harold could not take from her without taking the coat, and the coat was cold-weather practical, and even Harold was not going to take her coat. She had not thought about that being something Caleb might recognize. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." Caleb nodded and said, "Okay," and pointed at the book. "Can we keep going? He's still lost." "He finds the river soon," she said. "Good," Caleb said. "He should just follow it." The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Thursday in the 4th week. She knew it had come because Silas was different at dinner that night. Not cold. He was never entirely cold these days, but more internal than usual, more in his own head. He ate what was on his plate and answered Caleb's questions and helped clear up after without any of this looking like a performance of normalcy. But she could see the letter sitting in his mind the way you see a weight someone is carrying if you know what weight looks like. Caleb went to bed. She was doing the last of the washing up when Silas came back into the kitchen and put the letter on the table. "Sit down," he said. She dried her hands and sat. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of the table with the letter in front of him and his arms crossed, which she had come to recognize as his posture for when he was working out what to say. "The lawyer confirmed some of it," he said. "The legal separation letter, the one I received 4 years ago. He was able to trace it back to a law firm in Philadelphia, a firm that works primarily for a man named Harold Harper." He paused. "You never authorized it." "No," she said. "There's more. The lawyer has a contact in the Pennsylvania court system who confirmed that a woman matching your description was declared mentally incompetent twice between 1887 and 1888. Both petitions were filed by Harold Harper. Both were granted by the same judge, a man named Comstock." He said the name flatly, like it tasted bad. "Comstock has since retired, under some pressure, apparently." Evelyn folded her hands on the table. "And Voss?" "Reginald Voss. Yes, he's dead. August, like you said. The estate is in probate." Silas paused. "The marriage is on record, October 1888. His jaw was tight. "Over your formal objection, which is also on record." The kitchen was very quiet. "There's no record of you leaving here voluntarily," he said. "I asked about that specifically. The lawyer couldn't find anything. No ticket purchase, no record of a journey, nothing. Which doesn't prove you were taken. But it doesn't disprove it either." "Clara could confirm it," she said. "The kitchen maid. She's still in Philadelphia, as far as I know. She left Harper's house a few months ago before I did. I have an address." He looked at her. "You have an address?" "She gave it to me when she left. She told me to find her if I made it out." She reached into her coat pocket. A habit, always the coat, always the pocket. and produced a folded scrap of paper that she had been carrying since Clara pressed it into her hand at a back door in the dark. She set it on the table. Silas picked it up and looked at it, set it back down. He was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked up at him. "I spent 4 years thinking you chose to leave us," he said. His voice was even, but it was an evenness that was costing him something. "I spent 4 years angry at you and building a life around that anger because it was easier than—" He stopped. "I told Caleb his mother was gone, and I let him grow up believing it. And you were in a locked room in Philadelphia for 3 of those 4 years trying to get back." "Silas, let me finish." He pressed his hand flat on the table. "I'm not saying I can fix it overnight. I'm not saying I know what to do with everything I thought I knew that was wrong. But I owe you the acknowledgement that I was operating on information that wasn't true, and that you were telling me the truth, and I should have—" "How could you have known?" she said. "How could you have known anything different? You got a letter from a lawyer, you had a son to raise. You did what made sense with what you had." She held his gaze. "I'm not angry with you, Silas. I was never angry with you." He looked at her for a long time. "I was angry with you," he said. "I was angry for a long time." "I know. Some of that—" He looked away. "Some of it might still be in there. I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure out what's actually mine and what was just what I built to hold myself together." She understood that. She had done the same thing. "Take your time," she said. He picked up the letter from Cheyenne and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'm going to write to that address," he said. "To Clara." "She'll write back," Evelyn said. "She's not afraid of anyone. She never was." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "She helped you escape," he said. "I believe it. Barsam." They didn't arrive suddenly at something uncomplicated. That was not how it worked, and Evelyn was old enough and had been through enough to be suspicious of sudden arrivals anyway. What happened instead was a gradual accumulation of moments, the kind that only resolve into something meaningful when you look back at them later. There was the morning she was trying to repair a spoke on the wagon wheel, and it was going badly. The iron was being uncooperative, and her hands were cold, and she had said something under her breath that was not polite. And Silas appeared beside her without any announcement and said, "You're holding it wrong," and took the tool from her and showed her, not patiently exactly, but practically, with the directness that was just how he communicated. And then when she tried it again and it worked, he said, "There," and walked away. And it was a small thing, but it was not nothing. There was the evening Pete came to the kitchen door, looking uncomfortable, and told Silas that 2 of the cattle in the south pasture were showing signs of something, and he didn't know what. And Silas went to assess and came back an hour later with the particular expression he got when a problem was solvable but would require sustained effort. And Evelyn said, "What is it?" And he told her about the cattle and the treatment, and she asked several questions that he answered, and somewhere in the middle of it they were just talking, the way they had talked once, directly and practically, and without performance. And they both noticed it, and neither of them mentioned it. There was Caleb. Caleb was a constant. Caleb sat between them at dinner and told them things about his day with the impartiality of a newspaper, and occasionally asked questions of a startling directness that forced them to say things out loud they might otherwise have let live silently. He asked Evelyn once why she didn't have more dresses. He asked Silas once why he didn't talk to Evelyn the same way he talked to Pete, and Silas had looked at his son for a moment with an expression that Evelyn had to look away from because it was private, and said, "That's a fair question." And then dinner continued. 4 weeks in, she needed to go to town for supplies, and Silas said he would come with her. He said it like it was a practical decision. He needed to speak with Hector Daniels about an order for fencing materials. And it was, partly. But she understood from the way Martha Greer watched them come in together that it was also a statement. Caldwell Creek was a community that ran on what it observed. It would observe this. They moved through town side by side without touching, with the specific loaded quality of 2 people who were being careful about something. She got what she needed at the general store. He spoke to Hector. They met at the wagon afterward. Douglas Hale was across the street. He was watching. She had been thinking about Douglas Hale, about what Pete had told her, offhandedly, when she'd asked about the town. that Hale had been advising Silas on some property questions, that he had an interest in the ranch's legal situations. She had not yet figured out exactly what shape that interest took, but she had learned in Harold Harper's house to pay attention to men whose interest in other people's legal situations went beyond the professional. Silas had seen Hale watching too. She could tell by the set of his shoulders. "What's his involvement?" she said quietly, as he helped her up to the wagon seat. Silas was quiet for a moment. He came around and climbed up on his side. "He's handled some paperwork for the ranch. Grazing rights dispute a couple of years back. Mineral rights question." "That's a lot of interest in one ranch," she said. He glanced at her. "Why?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm probably wrong." "But—" She watched Hale turn and walk back toward his office. "But I spent 4 years watching men like him and learning what their interest looks like. And his interest in this ranch doesn't look entirely like legal representation." Silas was quiet for the length of the street until the town was behind them. Then he said, "He came to me about 18 months ago, said he had a buyer interested in the North pasture land. I said I wasn't selling." "Did he come back?" "Twice." She looked at him. "Did you tell him about the lawyer in Cheyenne? About what you were verifying?" A pause. "Not directly, but Caldwell Creek is a small town," she said. "Yes." She thought about that for the rest of the drive back to the ranch. She thought about men who wanted land and the specific ways they went about getting it when direct purchase wasn't available. She had seen enough of those methods in Harold's business dealings. The ways information could be used, and leverage applied, and legal mechanisms turned to purposes that had nothing to do with law. She didn't say any of this to Silas, not yet. She needed to know more, but she stored it carefully in the part of her mind she had learned in the room on Chestnut Street to keep organized and useful. Clara's letter came on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after Evelyn arrived in Caldwell Creek. It was longer than she expected, 6 pages in Clara's round, emphatic hand, the handwriting of someone who had educated herself without formal instruction and was proud of it with good reason. Clara had always been like that, specific and unornamented and proud in a way that Evelyn had admired enormously, had recognized as genuine toughness rather than performance. The letter confirmed everything. It confirmed the abduction. It confirmed the locked room, the false physician, the forced marriage. It confirmed dates, described witnesses by name and description, people who could be found and questioned. It confirmed Clara's own role in getting the original letter out and why it had stopped in Cheyenne and what had happened when she had finally, after 3 years in that house, managed to arrange her own departure by the simple method of refusing, one morning, to do anything anyone asked of her until the situation became inconvenient enough for Harold to let her go rather than deal with the spectacle. And it contained something Evelyn had not known. Clara had kept records. For 4 years, out of the same stubborn documentation impulse that had driven her to write everything in the margins of her primers, Clara had written down dates and names and events in a small notebook she kept hidden under a loose board in the pantry floor. She still had the notebook. She had taken it with her when she left. She was willing to send it if Silas Boone requested it directly, or to appear in person if that would be useful. "Tell him," Claire had written at the end, "that I have very sturdy shoes and am not afraid of trains." Silas read the letter without expression. He read it twice. When he put it down, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, and she waited. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said at last. "She is," Evelyn said. "She's the reason I'm here." He looked at the letter again. Then he looked at Evelyn, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, she saw something in his face that was not caution or wariness or pain, but something older than those, something from before all of this, something she recognized. "I'm going to write back to her," he said. "I'm going to ask her to send the notebook. She'll send it. And then I'm going to find out what can be done legally." His voice was quiet, but it had something underneath it now, something with direction. "About Harper, about the forced marriage, about all of it." He paused. "I'm not going to let this just sit." She had not expected that. She had expected, she realized, a man who would believe her and absorb the information and then maintain a private anger that would eventually soften. She had not quite expected action. "Silas," she said. "No." He said it gently but without room for argument. He took 4 years. He took you from Caleb. He stopped, pressed his lips together. I'm not letting him keep what he took, that's all. She looked at her hands. They were calloused now, from the work of the past 5 weeks, in a way that Philadelphia hands were not. She had blisters along the inside of her right palm that were just beginning to harden into something that would eventually be unremarkable. I'll help, she said. I know how he operates. I know the names. I know you will. He picked up the letter. We'll start tomorrow. From upstairs came the thump of Caleb getting out of bed to investigate something. A sound, a noise. The general principle that if anything was happening at any hour, it was worth investigating. And then the creak of him moving toward the stairs. Silas looked at the ceiling. She looked at the ceiling. He has absolutely no ability to stay in bed, Silas said. He gets that from you, she said. He looked at her. How would you know that? You left when he was 3 months old. I know it from you, she said. You used to get up at 3 a.m. to check on things that didn't need checking. A silence. And then for the first time in 5 weeks, Silas Boone almost smiled. It was partial and careful and aware of itself, but it was there. Caleb appeared at the bottom of the stairs in his nightshirt, with his hair in complete disarray, looked at both of them with bright eyes that meant he had not been asleep at all. I heard talking, he said. Go back to bed, Silas said. What were you talking about? Things that are not your business yet, Silas said. Bed. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She gave him a firm nod. He made a face that was exaggerated and theatrical and went back upstairs, making noise every step of the way, and she heard the deliberate creaking as he climbed back into his bed and the subsequent pointed silence of a child performing sleep. Silas looked at the ceiling again. He has so much work, he said, not with complaint, with something that was somewhere between exhaustion and deep affection and a kind of helpless pride. I know, she said. He's wonderful. He looked at her again, and this time whatever he was working out let him look a little longer before he looked away. Get some sleep, he said. We have work to do. She went to the room off the kitchen, and she lay on the creased mattress. And outside the window the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and full of stars, and she thought about Clara with her sturdy shoes and her notebook full of dates, and about Silas writing a letter tomorrow, and about the look on his face when he'd said, I'm not letting him keep what he took. She thought about Caleb's deliberate theatrical creaking from upstairs. She was not safe yet. She knew that. Harold was still out there, and Hale was still watching from across the street, and there were legal battles ahead that she could not fully see the shape of yet. But she was here. She was working. She had a son who dreamed of lavender, and a man who was starting, slowly and imperfectly and with appropriate caution, to let the walls down. It was not a resolved thing, but it was real. And real was, at this point, more than enough. Clara's notebook arrived on a Wednesday, wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen twine, and it was smaller than Evelyn had expected. A slim thing, the kind of composition notebook you could buy at any dry goods store for a few cents, its cover soft and warped from years of being hidden under a pantry floor. Silas set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment before he opened it, the way you look at something that you know is going to change things. Evelyn sat across from him and watched him read. The notebook was organized by date, which was the most Clara thing imaginable. January 14th, 1888. He refused to sign consent to marriage for the second time. Dr. Whitmore called same afternoon. Declaration signed. No examination performed. March 2nd, 1888. Heard E through the door asking to write a letter. Mr. H said no. October 17th, 1888. Ceremony. E said no twice before the officiant. Mr. V nodded to Mr. H. Ceremony continued. On and on through 3 years of small, careful handwriting, dates and names and precise clinical observations that added up, page by page, to something that was extremely difficult to argue with. Silas read every page. When he finished, he closed the notebook and put both hands flat on it and looked at the table for a while. Whitmore, he said, the physician. He's still in Philadelphia. He has a practice on Walnut Street. His name is in here 14 times. He was Harold's insurance policy, she said. If anyone questioned the competency declaration, Harold could say there had been a full medical assessment. Dr. Whitmore would confirm it. And would he? Now? She thought about the doctor, gray-haired, soft-spoken, a man who had clearly convinced himself that what he was doing was a form of care rather than a form of complicity. "I think," she said slowly, "that if someone asked him the right questions in the right setting, he would tell the truth. I don't think he's a brave man, but I think he's a man who's been carrying something heavy and might be relieved to put it down." Silas absorbed this. "And the judge, Comstock, retired, like the lawyer in Cheyenne said, but retirement doesn't erase a record." He looked at her. "How do you know all this?" "I had 4 years with nothing to do but read whatever Harold allowed in the room and think about every person who was involved in keeping me there," she said. "I built it all out in my head, every piece. I had nothing but time." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him processing, not doubting her, that period seemed to have ended, but working out the architecture of what she'd just described. The planning that had happened inside a locked room, the way the mind could turn constraint into a kind of preparation. "I'm going to take this to Cheyenne," he said. "In person. I'm not trusting it to letters anymore." He looked at the notebook. "I want a real lawyer, not Hale." She had been waiting for him to arrive at that conclusion on his own, and was relieved he had. "There's a firm in Cheyenne, Alderman and Burke. I found the name through the county records the last time I was in town. They handle Eastern interests. They'll have contacts in Philadelphia who can move on this." He looked at her. "You found it through the county records?" "I've been researching." He looked at her steadily. "When?" "Every trip to town. There's a territorial office that keeps public records. I've been going through them." She held his gaze. "I told you I'd help." Something in his expression shifted. Something that was partly respect and partly, she thought, a recalibration of what he was looking at. He had known, on some level, that she was competent. He had seen her work the fence line and manage the accounts he'd let her look at, and handle the complications of being back in a community that wasn't sure whether to accept her. But this was a different kind of competent, and she could see him taking it in. "All right," he said. "I'm going to Cheyenne at the end of the week. 3 days. Good. You'll be here with Caleb?" "Of course." He picked up the notebook and put it carefully in the inside pocket of his coat. Then he looked at her one more time with the expression she had still not entirely learned to read. The one that was not quite closed anymore but wasn't fully open either. The one that seemed to be measuring a distance that was slowly, imperfectly becoming shorter. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes?" "When this is over—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not saying I know what I want. I'm not there yet. But when this is over, the legal part, the Harper part, I want to talk about what comes next." She looked at him carefully. "Okay," she said. "That's all I'm saying." "I know." She paused. "It's enough." He nodded once and went to make arrangements for the trip, and she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee and thought that she had waited 4 years and she could wait a little longer, and also that she had not entirely expected to feel this particular thing, this fragile, not quite hope, and that it was uncomfortable, and she was glad of it anyway. The 3 days Silas was in Cheyenne were not quiet. She had expected quiet. She had expected the particular contained rhythm that a household settles into when one of its anchors is temporarily absent. Work, meals, Caleb, evening, repeat. She had been managing pieces of the ranch more and more independently over the past weeks, and she had felt, without making too much of it, that Silas had been gradually, and without announcement, extending her that latitude. It was the kind of thing he would never name directly. He just started going to the east pasture and letting her handle whatever came up at the house, and it accumulated. She was in the barn on the first morning, working on a harness that had developed a weak point at the buckle, when Pete came in from the road looking like a man who was trying not to look worried and wasn't succeeding. "There's a man out front," he said, "asking for Mr. Boone." She kept her hands on the harness. "What kind of man?" "Eastern clothes, came on a horse that's not from around here. Good horse, city horse. Asked for Mr. Boone by name." Pete paused. "Asked if Mrs. Boone was on the property." She set the harness down. What's his name?" Said his name was Garrett. Didn't give a first name. She did not know a Garrett, but she knew the type. She knew it from the 2 men who had come to the ranch in 1887 and held something under her nose, and from the various agents and associates of Harold Harper's that she had seen come and go from Chestnut Street over 4 years. There was a particular quality to men who operated in Harold's orbit, something practiced about the way they presented themselves, a kind of surface pleasantness that was installed over something less pleasant, the way paint went over wood. "Tell him Mr. Boone is away on business and expected back Thursday," she said. "Tell him if he wants to leave a message, he's welcome to." Pete looked relieved to have an instruction. "Yes, ma'am. And Pete, stay where you can see him while he's on the property." Pete nodded and went back out. She finished with the harness and then moved, casually and without apparent hurry, to the barn door where she could see the front of the house. The man called Garrett was exactly what Pete's description had suggested. 40, perhaps, well-dressed in the specific way of men who traveled frequently and paid attention to appearances as a professional matter. He was talking to Pete with a pleasant expression and looking at the house with the specific quality of interest that was not architectural. He looked at the barn. She stepped back into the shadow of the doorframe, enough that she was not visible, and watched him. He talked to Pete for another few minutes, accepted the message with apparent graciousness, and rode back toward the road. At the gate, he turned his horse and looked back at the property for a moment, a slow, deliberate look that covered the house, the barn, the yard, and then he rode on. She stayed where she was for a long time after he'd gone. That evening, after Caleb was in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the county record abstracts she'd brought home from town and went through everything she'd found on the Boone property. Land title, grazing rights, the mineral rights question Silas had mentioned. She was looking for something specific, the shape of an interest. She found it at past midnight in a transfer record from 1889, when her eyes were tired and the lamp was burning low. Douglas Hale had filed a claim on a strip of land that abutted the north pasture of the Boone Ranch, filed it on behalf of an unnamed eastern interest, which was how these things were sometimes recorded when the actual beneficiary wanted to remain unattributed. The claim was pending, which meant it had been filed but not yet adjudicated. The date on the filing was 6 months after Silas had received the false legal separation letter from Philadelphia. She stared at that date. Then she stared at it again. She took a piece of paper and began to write down what she knew in order. Harold's abduction of her in early 1887. The false separation letter sent to Silas in late 1887. Hale's approach to Silas about buying the north pasture in, she was working from memory, from what Silas had told her in the wagon, approximately 1890. Hale's property claim on behalf of an eastern interest, filed 1889. The man called Garrett, appearing 2 days after Silas left for Cheyenne. She sat with the sequence for a long time. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the page, "What does the north pasture have that someone in the east wants badly enough to go to all this trouble?" She did not know the answer yet, but she was going to find it. Silas came back from Cheyenne on Thursday as expected, arriving mid-afternoon with his horse tired and himself not much better. She gave him time to see to the horse and wash up before she put food in front of him, and then, while he ate, told him about Garrett. He set his fork down. What did he look like? She described him. Silas's jaw tightened at the horse, city horse, and tightened further at the description of the deliberate look at the property before Garrett rode out. "He didn't speak to you directly?" "He didn't see me. I stayed in the barn." Silas looked at her. She could see him processing whether this was caution or fear, and she wanted him to land on caution, which it was. "Good," he said. "There's more." She put the paper in front of him, the sequence she had written out the night before, the dates, the connections. She watched him read it. "The north pasture," she said. "What did you tell me about the mineral rights question?" He looked up. Hale handled it. There was a question about whether a previous filing had reserved rights on any mineral deposits on the property. I told him I was certain no such filing existed, and he said he'd look into it. Did he report back? He said it was resolved. Did he show you documentation? A silence. No, Silas said. She put her finger on the transfer record she'd found. This is a claim, filed in 1889, on a strip of land along your north boundary, filed through Hale's office, on behalf of an eastern interest that isn't named. He looked at it for a long time. That strip, he said. His voice had gone quiet and flat. That's where the water comes through. The creek that feeds the north pasture comes through that strip. She had not known that specifically, but was not surprised. If someone owned that strip, They'd control the water access to the north pasture, he said. The north pasture is the largest grazing section on the ranch. Without reliable water, he stopped. His hand was very still on the table. You'd have to sell, she said. He said nothing. Silas, I think Harold and Hale are connected. I think the separation letter, making you believe I chose to leave, was partly to destabilize you. A man managing grief and a young child alone is a man who might be more vulnerable to a sustained pressure campaign on his property. She looked at him steadily. I don't think it started with you. I think it started with Harold wanting to get me back, and then discovering that there was a land opportunity here, and deciding to work both angles simultaneously. She watched him absorb this. She watched his face go through something, anger, which she expected, and underneath it something older and raw that was the specific kind of hurt that came from discovering you had been played for a longer game than you realized. How certain are you? He said. I'm not entirely certain. It's a pattern, not proof, but it fits, he said. Yes. He pushed back from the table and stood up and went to the window. Outside the yard was going golden in the late afternoon light, and she could see Caleb at the far fence talking to the brown horse that he had apparently formed a lasting relationship with. What did Alderman and Burke say? She asked. They're moving on the Philadelphia end. They have a contact in the Pennsylvania court system who's already aware of the Comstock situation. Apparently Comstock's retirement was not entirely voluntary, and there are people who have been looking for grounds to review some of his decisions. He turned around. They said if Clara is willing to make a formal statement, and if Whitmore can be persuaded to confirm, there are grounds for a full review of the competency declarations, which would void the forced marriage and reestablish your legal standing. That's what we need. And on the property side, he looked at the paper on the table. I need a different lawyer for that. Someone who isn't Hale. Alderman and Burke handle property. I know, I asked them. He came back to the table, sat down. I told them about Hale, about the property claim, about the approach to buy the north pasture. How did they respond? Very carefully, he said, which I have learned means that what you've told them is significant, and they don't want to say how significant until they've looked at it. She almost smiled. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into his coat and put a piece of paper on the table beside the notebook. Alderman gave me this. It's a wire that came to their office 3 days ago, from someone in Harold Harper's legal team in Philadelphia. He paused. They claim that Evelyn Harper, that you, came east under duress, fraudulently, that you were under legal guardianship and your departure constitutes a violation of that guardianship. She looked at the wire. They're filing for your return, Silas said, formally, through the federal court. She had known this was coming. She had known it in the way you know a storm is coming when you feel the pressure change in the air. Not surprised exactly, just aware that the waiting period was ending and the harder part was beginning. How long do we have? She said. Before the filing reaches a Wyoming court? Alderman estimates 3 to 4 weeks, maybe less if Harold pushes it. Then we need to move faster. Alderman knows that. They're already in contact with the people in Pennsylvania. He looked at her. There's something else. What? Alderman asked me something about your legal status here. He paused. About whether you were... about our situation. She understood. What did you tell him? I told him it was complicated. She nodded. It is. He said, Silas continued carefully, that it would be significantly simpler from a legal standpoint if there was a clear and documented... He stopped, started again. He said a wife has standing that an estranged wife doesn't have. He said in Wyoming territory specifically, a woman's legal status in relation to her husband is Silas. She said his name quietly. You don't have to make it a legal argument. He looked at her. I'm not. That's not why I'm... He pressed his hand flat on the table. I don't want to use it as leverage. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't want you to think I'm raising it because of the legal argument. She looked at him for a long moment. Then why are you raising it? Because I've been in Cheyenne for 3 days, he said, thinking about nothing except how to fix this, And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I realized I was thinking about it differently than I would have thought about it 6 weeks ago. He said this with the specific directness that was just how he spoke. No performance, no ornamentation. 6 weeks ago, you were someone I needed to decide whether to believe. Now you're different. Now you're... He stopped again. You don't have to say it, she said. No, he said. I should say it. He looked at her. You're Evelyn. That's what I realized. You're just... you. Which is what I... He stopped a third time and looked briefly like a man who was annoyed at his own inability to finish a sentence, which was so specifically Silas that she had to work hard not to look away. I didn't stop, he said finally. I told myself I did. I was very certain I did, but I didn't. The kitchen was very quiet. She had not quite expected this moment to arrive on a Thursday afternoon, with leftover dinner on the table and the sound of Caleb talking to a horse drifting in through the window. She had not expected it to arrive on any particular schedule. She had told herself, carefully, over the past 6 weeks, not to expect anything at any specific time. Silas, she said, you don't have to... I didn't stop either, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever you need to do, however long it takes, however complicated it stays, I didn't stop. He looked at her with the expression she had finally learned to read. It was not closed, and it was not open. It was something more specific than either of those. It was a man letting himself feel the full weight of something he had been keeping at arm's length for a very long time and deciding consciously to stop holding it away. Okay, he said very quietly. She nodded. Outside, Caleb had apparently told the horse something funny, because he was laughing, a full, unself-conscious child's laugh that carried across the yard and through the window and into the kitchen like light through a gap in clouds. They both looked toward the sound automatically, and they were both quiet for a moment, and then Silas looked back at her. I need to figure out who Garrett is, he said. Back to practical. Back to forward momentum. But different now, and they both knew it. I have a description, she said. Alderman might be able to run it down on the Philadelphia end. I'll wire them tonight. He stood, picked up the transfer record from the table, looked at it. And tomorrow I'm going to go talk to Hector Daniels about this strip of land. Hector's been in Caldwell Creek for 30 years. He'll know every claim that's ever been filed on this end of the county. What about Hale? Not yet. His voice was careful. I don't want him to know we're looking until we know what we're looking at. Agreed. He moved to go, then stopped. Evelyn? Yes. You did well, he said, while I was gone, finding that record, handling Garrett the way you did. He said it simply, without embellishment. She looked at him. I know how to manage my father's men, she said. I've had a lot of practice. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but had the bones of one. I know, he said. I'm starting to understand what you're made of. You always knew, she said. You just forgot. He thought about that for a moment, and then he went to wire Alderman, and she cleared the table, and the evening settled around the ranch the way Wyoming evenings did, large and quiet and indifferent to the specifics of human trouble, which was somehow both humbling and sustaining. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, Silas came back from town with Hector Daniels walking beside him and a look on his face that Evelyn had not yet seen. She was in the yard splitting kindling, a task she had become competent at over the past weeks in the specific graceless way that you became competent at something through sheer repetition rather than natural aptitude when they came through the gate. She stuck the hatchet in the block and waited. Hector Daniels took off his hat. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something for a while and had decided with some relief to put it down. Mrs. Boone, he said, I owe you a conversation. She looked at Silas. Hector came to me, Silas said. I hadn't even asked him yet. Hector turned his hat in his hands. He was a big man, gone heavy with age, with a face that had spent 40 years in Wyoming weather. I've been watching since you came back, he said to Evelyn. Watching how you work, how you are with the boy. I've been watching Silas. He paused. And I've been watching Hale. What about Hale? She said. Hector looked at Silas, then back at her. About 6 months after you disappeared, Mrs. Boone, before we knew what had happened, When Silas was just trying to keep the ranch together, a man came to see Hale. Came through on a Thursday, stayed 2 nights, met with Hale at the office both days. Eastern man. I didn't know him, but I know Eastern men when I see them. She went very still. I didn't think much of it at the time, Hector continued. Hale gets Eastern clients sometimes. Land interests. I put it out of my mind, he paused. Until you came back and I started thinking about the timing and I started remembering things I'd put away. What did the man look like? Silas said. Hector described him. The description was not precise, but it covered the general territory. Older, 50s, well-dressed, with a particular manner that Hector described as like he was used to things going the way he planned them. Harold Harper was in his mid-50s. He was always well-dressed. He was absolutely accustomed to things going the way he planned them. That's not all, Hector said. He put his hand in his coat and produced a folded paper. I found this in my records last night, from 1889. It's a copy of a property survey that Hale commissioned. I was on the county survey board at the time, so we kept copies of anything filed in the county. I forgot I had it until I was thinking back. She took the paper. The survey covered the strip of land along the north boundary of the Boone Ranch, and in the corner, in a notes section that was easy to overlook, was a notation in small, precise handwriting. Water Rights Assessment commissioned by H.H. Philadelphia, H.H. Harold Harper. She held the paper carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you've been looking for it for a long time and finally found it. He was here, she said. Not a question. Someone representing him was here, Hector said. 6 months after you disappeared. Silas looked at the paper in her hands. His face was very controlled. So it wasn't just about her, he said. It was never just about her. No, she said. I don't think it was. I think Harold saw an opportunity on 2 fronts and managed both of them at once. She paused. He's very efficient. You made a mistake, Silas said. She looked at him. He came after the land while you were gone, Silas said, which means there's a paper trail. Hale filed things. The survey is filed, the claim is filed. He took the survey from her hands carefully. That's not the work of a man who thought he was going to get caught. That's the work of a man who thought the whole thing was going to go smoothly and didn't bother to cover it. He's always done that, she said. He's always been so certain of the outcome that he hasn't been careful enough about the process. Hector was watching both of them with the quiet attention of a man who had decided to commit to a side and was observing the thing he'd committed to. What do you need from me? He said. A signed statement, Silas said, about the Eastern visitor, about the survey copy, about when you received it and who filed it. I'll write it today. And Hector, Silas looked at him. I need you to be careful about who you talk to about this. Hale is still in town. He doesn't know yet what we have. Hector put his hat back on. Son, he said, in the tone of a man who had been keeping town business since before Silas was born, I know how to keep my mouth shut. He went back toward town, and they stood in the yard with the morning cold around them and the survey in Silas's hands and the hatchet still in the splitting block, and Silas looked at her. It's enough, he said. With Clara's notebook and Hector's statement and the survey, it's enough to take to Alderman. Almost, she said. Almost? We still need to know who Garrett is, and we need to know exactly how Hale and Harold are connected. Not just the survey, but the arrangement, the financial arrangement. She looked at the ranch around her, the barn and the pasture and the distant line of the north fence she had repaired in the first week with Caleb beside her. Harold doesn't do anything that isn't about money. There's money involved in this land, and I need to know exactly what it is before we move. Silas studied her. The mineral rights question, he said. The one Hale said he'd resolved. Yes. You think there actually are mineral deposits? I think Harold Harper doesn't travel from Philadelphia to Wyoming for water access, she said. He has people who do that for him. He came, or sent someone who represented him directly, because something here is worth the personal investment. Silas looked at the north pasture, at the line of land beyond it that contained the strip with the pending claim. I know someone in the Territorial Geological Survey, he said slowly. A man named Burris. He was out here 2 years ago mapping water tables. Would he remember the land? He'd have records. He looked at her. I'll write to him today. She nodded. Then she went back to the splitting block and pulled out the hatchet because the kindling still needed splitting and the morning wasn't getting any warmer. She heard him behind her, still standing in the yard, and then the sound of his boot on the porch as he went inside to write letters. And she thought, they were building something, not just the legal case, not just the defense against what Harold was trying to do, something more than that. She was not going to name it yet, but it was there. She could feel its weight the way you feel a foundation when you're standing on it, solid under everything, even when you're too busy splitting wood and writing letters and fighting your father and not quite saying what you mean to stop and look down. The hatchet came down clean, the wood split. She stacked it against the barn wall and went back for more. On Sunday evening, without planning it or announcing it, Silas sat on the porch after dinner, and Evelyn came out and sat beside him, and they were both quiet for a while, looking at the range in the fading light. Caleb was inside, supposedly finishing schoolwork, actually intermittently visible through the window doing everything but. It was Silas who spoke first. "Garrett came back," he said. She turned. "When?" "This afternoon, while you were in town. Pete saw him on the road, not coming in, just sitting on the road and looking at the property." He paused. "He left after about 20 minutes. She thought about this. "He's establishing the lay of it." "That's what I think, too. He'll come back when Harold gets a response from the federal court, when there's something to serve." She looked out at the range. "We have maybe 2 weeks before that happens. Alderman is moving." "I know, but Harold moves fast when he's threatened." She folded her hands. "We need to be ready for him to do something before the legal process runs its course. He's not a man who waits for courts." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things now. "Of Harold? No. I know him too well to be afraid. I know his limits." She paused. "I'm afraid of the timing, of what happens if he gets to a Wyoming court before we have everything in front of aldermen." "I won't let them take you," he said, quietly and without drama, which was what made it absolutely convincing. She looked at him. He was watching the range, his profile in the last of the light, and she thought about how he had changed in 6 weeks. Not fundamentally. The fundamental thing was exactly what it had always been, but the layer that grief and anger had built over the top of it was gradually coming off in the way that layers do when the reason for them has been addressed. "I know," she said. "I mean it practically," he said. Not just as a statement. Alderman said that a federal court order would require the sheriff to enforce it. The sheriff in this county is Tom Warwick. "I know Tom Warwick." He had nodded at her twice at the general store. "Not warm, but not hostile." "Tom and I have worked cattle together for 8 years, Silas said. "I'm going to talk to him tomorrow. I'm going to tell him everything. I want him to know the full picture before anyone shows up with a piece of paper." She nodded slowly. "That's smart." "I'm occasionally smart," he said, the driest possible tone. She looked at him, and something in her face must have given her away, because he looked back at her and the corner of his mouth did the thing it had been doing lately. Not quite a smile, but occupying the same territory. Inside the house, something fell, and Caleb's voice floated out. "I'm fine. It was a book." "Just a book," Silas said under his breath. "Definitely a book," she agreed. And for a moment, just that moment, on a porch in Wyoming with trouble gathering from the east and work still to be done, and nothing resolved and nothing guaranteed, it was simply the two of them, and the range, and the sound of their son claiming unconvincingly to be fine. It was enough. It had to be. The letter from Burris, the territorial geologist, arrived on a Monday and confirmed what Evelyn had suspected in the way that certain pieces of information confirmed things you already knew but needed proof of before you could act on them. There was silver in the ground beneath the strip of land along the north boundary of the Boone Ranch. Not a certainty. Burris was careful to use the appropriate scientific hedging, words like indications and survey suggests and further assessment warranted, but enough of an indication that a man with Harold Harper's resources and Harold Harper's nose for opportunity would have found it worth moving on. The creek that ran through the strip was incidental. The water rights had been the cover story. What Harold actually wanted was what was underneath. Silas read Burris's letter standing at the kitchen counter, and then he set it down and said very quietly, "Son of a..." and stopped himself because Caleb was in the next room. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He wasn't after you first," Silas said. He came out here for the land. I think he came for both, she said. I think when his associate surveyed the property and found the mineral indications, Harold saw a way to solve two problems at once. He'd been unhappy about our marriage since it happened. He'd always intended to bring me back under his control eventually. This gave him a mechanism. She paused. Taking me away destabilized you. A destabilized man is a man who might make decisions about his property that he wouldn't make otherwise. Silas's jaw was tight. He was going to wait me out, or apply pressure through Hale, or use the federal guardianship claim to tie up your legal standing as my husband. Multiple angles. She sat down at the table. Harold always works multiple angles. He underestimated something. Several things, she said. He underestimated that you'd keep the ranch intact. He underestimated Clara. He underestimated that I'd survive long enough to get out. She looked at him. And he underestimated how far you'd go once you knew the truth. Silas looked at Burris's letter for another moment. Then he folded it and put it with the growing collection of documents they had assembled. Clara's notebook, Hector's signed statement, the property survey with HH in the corner, Alderman's correspondence, the copy of the false legal separation letter. They had it all in a leather folder that Silas kept in the locked drawer of his desk. And every time something new went into it, the architecture of what Harold had done became more visible, more solid, more undeniable. I'm going to wire Alderman this morning, he said. This changes the filing. It strengthens it, she said. It adds motive. It makes the full picture visible. It also... He stopped. If there's silver in that ground, Evelyn, and the claim is defeated, and the property rights revert, then it's yours, she said. He looked at her. Ours, he said, careful and deliberate, the way he said things he'd decided to say. She held that word for a moment, then she nodded. Yes. He picked up the letter and his coat and went to send the wire, and she sat at the table in the early morning quiet and thought about Harold Harper waking up in his Philadelphia house right now, still believing, probably, that this was manageable, that distance and money and legal machinery would resolve things in his favor the way they always had, that his daughter would come back and the land would be secured and the disruption would be absorbed into the general order of his affairs. She thought about what it was going to feel like when he found out how wrong he was. The thought was not kind. She did not try to make it kind. She had earned this particular unkindness. Tom Warwick, the county sheriff, came to the ranch on Tuesday morning. Silas had sent word the previous day, and Warwick had come promptly, which told her something about the nature of his relationship with Silas, the kind of professional trust that came from years of working adjacent to each other in a place where reliability was not a courtesy but a survival requirement. He was a large man, Warwick, not heavy but broad, with a manner that was almost deliberately unremarkable. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and listened to everything Silas told him without interrupting, and then he asked several questions that were more precise than his surface presentation suggested. The federal filing, he said. Through what court? The district court in Cheyenne, Passon, Silas said. Alderman believes the petition will be filed within the next 10 days, and Alderman is filing a counterpetition. Already in process, Warwick looked at his coffee. If a federal order comes through before the counterpetition is heard, I'm obligated to enforce it. I know that. I want you to know I know you know that, Warwick said, because what I'm about to say sits on top of it. He looked at Silas directly. A federal order telling me to remand a Wyoming woman to the custody of an Eastern man based on a guardianship declaration that was issued by a judge now known to be compromised. That's the kind of order that a reasonable man in my position would want to examine very carefully before acting on. There might be questions I'd need answered. That process might take some time. Evelyn looked at him. He was looking at the table. It might take, Warwick continued, the kind of time it would take for a counterpetition to be heard, hypothetically. Hypothetically, Silas said. I'm not saying I'd obstruct a federal order, Warwick said. I'm saying I'm a careful man who takes his responsibilities seriously. And that means I don't act rashly on paperwork that has questions attached to it. He finally looked at Evelyn. Mrs. Boone, I was here when you left, when we thought you left. I saw what it did to this ranch and this man and that boy. I don't know the full story, but I know enough of it to know what kind of woman you are from how you've conducted yourself since you got back. He paused. I'll do what the law requires, but I'll do it slowly and carefully, and after thorough examination. "What?" "That's all we're asking," she said. He nodded once and drank the rest of his coffee and stood up. "One more thing," he said to Silas. "That man who's been watching the property. Garrett. He's been staying at the hotel in town since last Wednesday. He's paid through next Monday." Warwick put his hat on. "He met with Hale yesterday afternoon, about an hour." The air in the kitchen changed slightly. "Thank you," Silas said. "I'll keep watching," Warwick said. "You wire Cheyenne if anything changes." He left, and they sat with what he'd given them. And Evelyn thought about Garrett and Hale meeting for an hour, and what had been discussed in that hour, and what it meant for the timing. "Hale knows we're moving," she said. "Maybe. Or Garrett is just checking in with the local asset. Either way, it means they'll accelerate. If Harold thinks the legal counterfiling is in process, he'll want to get something served before it can be heard." She thought for a moment. "He'll push Garrett to move faster." "How fast?" "Faster than we want." She looked at him. "Silas, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When Garrett comes back, and he'll come back, probably with legal documentation, what do you want to do?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are two ways to handle this. We can wait for the legal process and trust Alderman and Warwick and the counterpetition. That's the cautious approach." She paused. "Or we can be less cautious." Define less cautious. She had been thinking about this since the night on the porch. Harold is operating from a distance. He's never been here. He doesn't know the terrain, not the physical terrain, not the social terrain. Everything he knows about this place and these people came from Hale. She looked at him steadily. Hale has been managing Harold's interests in this county for years by controlling information, by making sure Harold only saw what Hale wanted him to see. Silas was very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Hale is Harold's weakness out here. Everything Harold thinks he knows about the situation, about this ranch, about the property, about you and me and how things stand, comes through Hale." She paused. "What happens if Hale's position in this town becomes untenable before Harold can act?" Silas studied her. "You want to expose him." "I want to make it impossible for him to keep managing this for Harold. If Caldwell Creek knows what Hale has been doing, the false property claim, the connection to an Eastern interest that's been trying to acquire this land through manufactured leverage, he loses his ability to function here, and Harold loses his local mechanism. If we expose Hale before the legal process is complete, Harold still has the federal filing. I know, I'm not saying it's clean." She met his eyes. "I'm saying we're in a better position if Harold is fighting on two fronts simultaneously than if he has the luxury of focusing everything on the legal process." Silas was quiet for a long moment. She could see him turning it over, the logic of it, the risk of it, the specific weight of doing something that was strategically aggressive rather than defensively reactive. "Not yet," he said at last. "We need to wait for one more thing." "What?" "I want to hear from Alderman about the Philadelphia end first. If Whitmore has confirmed, if Clara's statement is formally filed, then exposing Hale here becomes part of a larger picture, not an isolated move." He paused. "If we move too early, Harold can characterize this as a local conflict, a husband protecting his property. With the Philadelphia confirmation in place, it becomes a pattern. It becomes a scheme." She thought about this. He was right. She knew he was right, and she also knew that her instinct to move was partly the accumulated result of 6 weeks of being still and careful when everything in her wanted to stop being still and careful. "All right," she said. "Alderman said 10 days at the outside before they had the Philadelphia confirmation." "Then we wait 10 days. 9, he said. "I want a day's margin." She almost smiled. The 9 days were the hardest, not because nothing happened. Things happen, small things. The ranch's constant demands, Caleb's school and dinner and evenings, and the ongoing project of two people building something in the space between what they'd been and what they were becoming. But under all of it was the awareness of a clock, of Garrett in his hotel room, of Hale going about his business in town with the particular confidence of a man who did not yet know what was coming. On the 4th day, Douglas Hale came to the ranch. She saw him from the barn, his horse, and his specific upright posture coming up the road in the early afternoon. She went to find Silas, who was in the south pasture, and by the time they came back to the yard, Hale had dismounted and was standing at the porch with the controlled expression of a man who had decided on a particular approach and was committed to it. "Silas," he said. He nodded at Evelyn in a way that was technically acknowledgement and nothing more. "I came to discuss the mineral rights question." "I thought you told me that was resolved," Silas said. "There's been a development." Hale's voice was smooth. He had a lawyer's voice, calibrated for apparent reasonableness. "A filing has come to my attention that suggests there may be a prior claim on a portion of your property that could affect the mineral rights picture." "What filing?" Silas said. Hale produced a paper. Silas took it and looked at it without expression. Evelyn looked at it from beside him. It was a description of the boundary strip, the same strip that was in the survey with HH in the corner, and a claim attached to it that she recognized immediately as the pending filing she had found in the county records. "This claim was filed in 1889, Silas said. "That's correct?" "By your office." A pause. Very brief. "On behalf of a client, yes." "Who is the client?" "I'm not at liberty to—" "Hale!" Silas's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It had something in it that Evelyn recognized as the specific quality he used when he was done with a particular direction of conversation. "I know who the client is. I know about the survey commissioned in 1889. I know about the visitor from Philadelphia in late 1887. And I know about the meeting you had with a man named Garrett at your office yesterday afternoon." The color in Hale's face changed by a fraction. Just a fraction. He was a practiced man, and he recovered quickly. "Silas, I'm not sure what you think you know." "I know enough," Silas said, "to have already shared everything I know with Alderman and Burke in Cheyenne and with the county sheriff." He handed the paper back to Hale. "I'm not going to discuss this further with you. Anything you need to say, you can say to Alderman." Hale looked at him. The practiced reasonableness had thinned, and underneath it was something else. Not quite panic, but the controlled precursor to it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "There are ways to resolve this that are beneficial to everyone. The claim on the boundary strip doesn't have to be contested. There are financial considerations that could—" "Get off my property," Silas said. Hale looked at Evelyn. She met his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing she needed to say. She had said everything she needed to say to men like Douglas Hale over the past 4 years in other ways, and the most important thing she had learned was that her silence was more useful to her than his conversation. He mounted his horse and rode back to the road, and Silas watched him go, and then turned to Evelyn with the controlled expression of a man who was keeping something tightly leashed. "He's going to wire Harold," she said. "Tonight," Silas agreed. "Then it'll move faster than 9 days." "I know." He looked at her. "I'm wiring Alderman right now." The wire from Alderman arrived the following morning, on the 5th day, and it said 3 things that mattered. Whitmore had confirmed. Clara's formal statement was filed, and the counter-petition had been accepted by the district court in Cheyenne and was scheduled for hearing in 11 days. 11 days was not as much time as they wanted. It was more than they'd feared. Silas and Evelyn stood in the kitchen and read the wire together, and then Silas said, "Whitmore confirmed," with something in his voice that was neither relief nor satisfaction, but some combination that she thought was what vindication actually felt like in the body. Not triumphant, just solid, like a floor that you'd been testing with cautious weight finally holding. "He would," she said. "He was always going to, once someone asked him the right way." "You said he was carrying something." "Everyone in that house was carrying something," she said. "The difference between them and Clara is that Clara was willing to put it down when she had the chance." He looked at her. "You're not angry." She considered this honestly. "I'm angry at Harold," she said. "At Hale. At the specific people who made specific choices." She paused. "Whitmore was a weak man who did what a stronger man told him to do and convinced himself it was medical practice. I'm not wasting my anger on him." She looked at the wire. "I'm saving it for where it counts." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had come to think of as the one he used when she had said something that aligned with how he saw the world in a way that still, sometimes, appeared to catch him slightly off guard, like he was still occasionally surprised to remember who she was. "I need to go tell Hector," he said. "Now?" "Today. If we're going to move on Hale, it has to be today. before Harold responds to whatever Hale wired him last night. He picked up his coat. And Martha Greer. She looked at him. Martha knows every person in this county, he said. And she's been waiting and watching since you got here, like she told you. I think she's decided where she stands. He paused. She was at the feed store this morning when I picked up the wire. She stopped me and asked how things were progressing. His voice was dry. In this county, that means she's ready to hear something. Evelyn thought about Martha Greer with her careful neutrality and her sister's situation and her particular quality of attention. She's going to be useful, she said. That's what I thought. He stopped at the door. Stay here. Keep Pete at the gate. If Garrett comes, I know, she said. I'll send for Warwick. He nodded and went, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she went to the desk and sat down and began to write a letter to Clara. Not about legal matters, just a letter. Just the things you write to the person who gave you back your own life when writing letters is suddenly something you can do again because the room has no lock on the door. By mid-afternoon, Caldwell Creek knew. She was not there to witness the telling, but Silas came back and described it, sitting at the kitchen table, looking tired in the specific way of someone who has done something necessary and unpleasant and important and is not sorry. And she constructed it from his account. He had told Hector first. Hector had listened to the full account with his hat in his hands, and at the end of it he had said with the particular Wyoming economy of feeling, that explains some things I should have paid more attention to a long time ago. And then he had straightened up and said, what do you need from me? What he needed was for Hector to tell his account to 3 specific people in town who were known for both honesty and the capacity to pass information to the right ears without embellishment. Hector had done this with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been in a community for 30 years and understood its architecture completely. Martha Greer had come out from behind her counter when Silas told her and stood in the middle of the store and listened with her arms folded and her mouth pressed into a thin line. And when he was done, she had said, Douglas Hale has handled 2 of my property transactions, in a tone that did not bode well for Douglas Hale, and then she had picked up her coat. She went to find Hale herself, Silas said. Evelyn looked at him. She went to find him? She did not go to confront him, he said. She went to make it clear to him that she was aware of the situation and was watching. Martha's watched everyone in this town for 30 years from behind that counter, and everyone in this town knows it. He paused. If Martha Greer has positioned herself publicly against your interests, it means something in this county. And has she? She told him, Silas said, that she had become aware of some concerns regarding his professional conduct and that she intended to be present at the counterpetition hearing in Cheyenne. Evelyn absorbed this. She's going to Cheyenne? She is, and she told 2 other women in town who are apparently also going. He looked at her with something in his face that was halfway between bemusement and respect. I've known Martha Greer for 15 years. I have never known her to travel to Cheyenne. She thought about this. She thought about what it meant, not just strategically, not just in terms of the hearing, but in terms of the weight of a community deciding where it stood. A community that had turned away from her on the platform in October, eyes at their boots, was now sending women to Cheyenne. What about Hale? She said. Hale is still in his office, Silas said. He had a visitor this afternoon. Garrett came in from the hotel. They were in there for 2 hours. He paused. Warwick has a man watching the office. She nodded. They're going to try to serve the federal order before the counter-petition is heard. That's what I think. When? Tomorrow, maybe. Or the day after. He looked at his hands on the table. Evelyn, I need to tell you something. The tone of his voice made her look at him more directly. The federal order, if they serve it before the hearing, and if Warwick can't find enough questions to slow it down, there's a possibility that they could try to physically remove you from the county. She held his gaze. I'm not going to let that happen, he said. But I want you to be clear-eyed about the possibility, because I don't want you to be caught off guard. I'm not easily caught off guard, she said. I know. He paused. I also want you to know that I've already spoken to Warwick about what response would be appropriate for me in that situation, and Warwick has given me his opinion, and his opinion is that a man has a right to protect his household. She looked at him. You're talking about legal right, among other things. Silas, I'm not planning anything reckless, he said. I'm telling you that I have thought through every scenario, and there is not a scenario in which I allow Harold Harper's men to walk onto this property and take you away from it." His voice was even and quiet and completely without rhetoric. "That's not a dramatic statement, it's just the truth." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know," she said, "that 4 years ago you would have found a more diplomatic way to say that." He thought about this. "Probably," he said. "I'm less interested in diplomacy than I used to be." Garrett came on a Thursday. He came in the morning when the light was still low and the air had the brittle quality of advancing November, and he was not alone. 2 men rode with him that she did not recognize, younger, heavier, the specific look of men who had been brought along for a purpose that had nothing to do with paperwork. Pete came to the barn where she was working and said, "Ma'am, men on the road." She was already moving. She went to the house, not running. Running would panic Pete, and she needed Pete steady. Silas was in the yard and had already seen them. She came to stand beside him. "Warwick?" she said. "I sent Pete as soon as I saw them from the south pasture." He was watching the riders come up the road with the stillness she had come to recognize as what he looked like when he was calm in the specific way that was more dangerous than agitation. "3 of them. 2 are for force," she said. "Garrett will have the paperwork." "Yes." The riders came through the gate. Garrett was in front, and he had his practiced pleasantness arranged on his face, and he stopped his horse 20 feet from where they were standing and said, "Mr. Boone, Mrs." He paused, a deliberate pause. "Harper." "Boone," Silas said. Garrett looked at Evelyn. He had light eyes and a quality of absolute professional detachment that she associated with men who had done a great many things they'd chosen not to have feelings about. "Ma'am, I have a document from the United States District Court that I've been asked to deliver." "Let me see it," Silas said. Garrett produced the paper and held it out. Silas took it and looked at it. She looked at it from beside him. It was the federal order. Competency guardianship, signed by a judge she did not recognize, directing the return of one Evelyn Marion Harper to the custody of her legal guardian, Harold James Harper, pending the outcome of ongoing guardianship review proceedings. "This order," Silas said, "is based on competency declarations issued by a judge named Comstock, who has since been subject to a formal review process, and a physician named Whitmore, who has formally recanted his assessment." He looked at Garrett. "It references legal proceedings in Pennsylvania that have been materially altered since this document was prepared." He folded it. "I'm going to give this to my attorney in Cheyenne, and he will respond to the court directly." Garrett's pleasant expression did not change. "Mr. Boone, the order requires immediate compliance." "The order requires response through proper legal process," Silas said, "which is what it will receive." "Sir, you're on my property," Silas said. "You came through my gate. I'm asking you to leave now, and I'm telling you that if you choose not to, the county sheriff, who was notified of your arrival 20 minutes ago, will assist you in understanding your options." As if on cue, and it was not quite on cue, it was about 40 seconds later, which was close enough, the sound of horses on the road preceded Tom Warwick through the gate with 2 deputies behind him. Warwick took in the scene with a single sweep and rode up to Garrett and said, "Morning," in the tone of a man who owned the horizontal and vertical of the situation. "You serving federal process in my county?" "That's correct," Garrett said, with slightly less smoothness than before. "I'll need to review the documentation," Warwick said. "Federal process in Wyoming Territory requires county verification of the underlying jurisdiction, and there are some questions about the issuing court's basis for jurisdiction that I've been in correspondence with my superiors about." He looked at Garrett with the mild, patient expression of a man who had all the time in the world. "My office has been expecting this filing and has some concerns we'll need to work through before I can facilitate enforcement. This is likely to take several days." Garrett looked at Warwick, looked at Silas, looked at Evelyn, who was looking at him with no particular expression. "Several days," Garrett said. "Minimum," Warwick said pleasantly. "Complex jurisdictional questions take time to work through properly. You're welcome to wait in town. There's a decent hotel." He paused. "You've been staying there already, I believe." A silence. One of the men behind Garrett shifted in his saddle. Warwick's deputies, who had not done anything except exist, continued to exist with a solid and unhurried quality that made their presence felt without requiring action. Garrett folded the federal order and put it back in his coat. "I'll be in contact with the court," he said. "That's your right," Warwick said. "I'll be in contact with mine." Garrett turned his horse and his two companions turned with him, and they rode back through the gate, and Warwick watched them go before he looked at Silas. "He'll wire Harper tonight," Warwick said. "I know," Silas said. "How much time does it actually buy us?" 3-4 days before they get a response from the court. Maybe less if they push hard. Warwick looked at Evelyn. "You need to be at that hearing, Mrs. Boone, in person." "I will be," she said. "The hearing is in 8 days," Warwick said. "I think 4 of those are manageable." He glanced down the road where Garrett had gone. "The other 4 are going to depend on what Harper does next." What Harold did next arrived not through Garrett, but through Douglas Hale, who appeared at the ranch the following morning, looking like a man who had made a decision that had cost him something to make. He came alone this time. No horse theater, no practiced smoothness. He tied his horse at the gate and walked to the porch and knocked, and when Evelyn opened the door, he was standing there with his hat in both hands and an expression that was not what she had expected. "I need to speak with you," he said, "both of you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back and let him in. Silas came from the back of the house and stopped when he saw Hale in the kitchen, and the expression on his face was controlled and wary, but he sat down, and Evelyn sat down, and Hale sat down, and for a moment none of them said anything. "Harper sent word last night," Hale said, "in response to what I wired him about Garrett being delayed." He set his hat on the table. "He's sending more men, not through Garrett, directly. He intends to enforce the federal order by force if the court process is delayed further." He paused. He said, his exact words were that he had never intended for this to take this long and that he was done waiting for legal process. Evelyn looked at him. "Why are you telling us this?" Hale looked at his hat. He was not, she thought, a man who had set out to cause the harm he had caused. He was a man who had made a series of decisions in which each step seemed manageable, and had not noticed the shape of the whole thing until he was already deep inside it. She recognized this. She had seen it in Whitmore, in the postal clerk in Cheyenne, in the lesser men in Harold's orbit. It did not excuse anything, but it explained a great deal. "Because," Hale said slowly, "when Harper sent that wire, there was something in it that he had not mentioned before. Something about what happens to the property claim after the land is secured." He looked up. "My name is on that claim, Mrs. Boone. It was filed by my office. I was told it was a straightforward mineral rights acquisition for a client who would handle the further steps." He paused. "The further steps, as described in last night's wire, are not steps I agreed to be part of." "What are the further steps?" Silas said. Hale told them. Harold's plan, as laid out in the wire that Hale had received, was not simply to acquire the boundary strip and its mineral rights. It was to use the combination of Evelyn's forced return and the existing federal order to challenge Silas's competency to manage the property, a mirror of what had been done to Evelyn in Philadelphia, and install a legal manager for the ranch that Harold could control. The silver would be extracted, the ranch would be managed into debt, and the whole property would eventually transfer to Harold's interests through a foreclosure proceeding that he would engineer. The silence when Hale finished was the specific kind of silence that follows something that is both shocking and, in retrospect, completely consistent with everything that had already been established. "He was going to do to you what he did to me," Evelyn said. "To both of you," Hale said. Silas looked at the table. He was very still. "Hale," he said at last, "what are you prepared to do?" Hale reached into his coat and placed 2 documents on the table. "A full account of my involvement with Harper's interests since 1887, signed and notarized, and the original correspondence from Harper's representative that I received when the survey was commissioned, including the name of the representative and Harper's authorization." He looked at Silas. "I'm not a brave man. I want that acknowledged. But I'm not going to be the mechanism for what he's planning." Silas picked up the documents and looked at them, looked at Evelyn. She gave a small nod. "You'll need to speak to Alderman," Silas said. "In Cheyenne. In person. I can leave tomorrow morning." "Today," Silas said. "This afternoon." Hale picked up his hat. He looked like a man who was smaller than he'd been when he sat down, which was appropriate. I'm sorry, he said. To both of you. I know it's inadequate. It is, Evelyn said. But what you've just put on that table matters more right now than what you're sorry for. Hale nodded and stood and left, and they heard his horse on the road, and then Silas exhaled slowly and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the documents Hale had left behind. The men Harold is sending, Evelyn said. How many days? From Philadelphia? 4, at the fastest. He looked at her. The hearing is in 8 days, so we have 4 days before they arrive and 4 days after. The 4 after depend on Warwick and Alderman and what we walk into that court with. She looked at what Hale had put on the table, his account, Harold's original correspondence, and then at the leather folder in the desk that held everything else they had gathered over the past 7 weeks. It was a considerable collection. It was the architecture of what Harold had done, and it was solid, and it was documented, and it was theirs. Then we walk into that court with everything, she said. Silas looked at her. In the back of the house, Caleb had come home from school and was making the sounds of a child depositing boots and a coat and a reader with cheerful lack of concern for where any of these things landed. In a moment, he would appear in the kitchen and ask what was for dinner and tell them something about his day with the specific editorial selection of a child who has decided what is important and leads with it. Yes, Silas said, we do. He reached across his table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and neither of them moved for a moment. And Caleb came around the corner of the kitchen doorway and stopped and looked at them, and then looked at his boots and back at them again. Are you holding hands? He said, with the tone of someone gathering data. Yes, Silas said. Caleb thought about this. Okay, he said. What's for dinner? The 4 days before Harold's men arrived were the kind of days that compress themselves in memory afterward, not because nothing happened, but because everything that happened carried the specific weight of things that cannot be undone once they are set in motion. Hale reached Cheyenne on Thursday evening. By Friday morning, he was in Alderman's office, and by Friday afternoon, Alderman had wired Silas 2 words, sufficient, ready. Clara arrived on Saturday. Evelyn had not expected her in person. She had expected the notebook, the signed statement, the correspondence, all of which had already been delivered and filed. She had not expected to open the kitchen door on a gray November morning and find Clara standing on the porch with a travel bag in one hand and the expression of a woman who had walked through considerably worse than a 2-day train journey and was not going to make any fuss about it. Clara was 41, stout, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent years in rooms where being noticed was a liability. She looked at Evelyn for a moment, and Evelyn looked at her, and then they did what neither of them had allowed themselves to do in all the years in that house on Chestnut Street, which was to simply hold on to each other for a moment without any professional distance at all. You made it, Clara said, into Evelyn's shoulder. We made it, Evelyn said. Clara pulled back and assessed her with the practical eye of a woman who had spent years monitoring Evelyn's physical condition from across a household divide. You look better than I expected, she said. You've been working outside. Every day. Good. Clara picked up her bag. Now, tell me what you need from me and how quickly you need it. What they needed was her presence at the hearing in Cheyenne in 3 days, and her willingness to testify in person to what she had documented in the notebook and what she had witnessed over 4 years. Clara said yes to both of these things in approximately 8 seconds, and then asked where she was sleeping and whether the coffee in Wyoming was any better than the coffee in Philadelphia. It was not, Evelyn told her, but it was hot. Harold's men arrived on Sunday. Not Garrett this time. Garrett had been Garrett's last trip, it turned out, because Garrett had wired his own employer's lawyers on Friday and formally withdrawn from the engagement after Warwick's deputies had paid him a visit and explained the specific contours of the jurisdictional situation. These were different men, 4 of them, harder and less practiced in pleasantness, with a wagon that was not for cargo. They came up the road on Sunday afternoon and Silas was at the gate. He was not alone. Hector Daniels was there, and Pete, and 2 men from neighboring ranches who had heard what was happening through the specific information network of a small frontier county, and had come without being asked, the way men did in places where community was not a courtesy, but a structure you maintained because you needed it to hold. Warwick was there too, with both deputies, positioned on the road in a way that was not technically blocking it, but communicated the relevant information. Evelyn watched from the porch. Caleb was inside with Clara, and Clara had been given one instruction: keep Caleb inside and keep him calm, which Clara was entirely capable of executing because Clara had spent years keeping a grown woman calm in circumstances considerably more difficult than this. The four men stopped at the gate. Warwick rode forward. He had the conversation with them, and she could not hear the specifics from the porch, but she could see the quality of it. Warwick's patient, immovable manner, the documents he produced from his coat, the specific way the men at the gate responded to the information they were being given. She had learned, in 4 years in Harold's house, to read conversations at a distance. These men had arrived with instructions that assumed a clear path to execution, and they were discovering that the path was not clear, and that discovery was producing the specific response of men who would need to wire their employer for new instructions before proceeding. After 20 minutes, they turned around. Silas came back to the porch. He looked tired. "They'll be back," he said. "Not before the hearing," she said. He looked at her. "You're sure? Harold won't authorize a forced move while there's an active court proceeding. It would compromise the legal claim." She had known Harold Harper for a long time, and she understood the hierarchy of his priorities. His legal mechanisms were his primary weapons, and he would not risk contaminating them with something that could be characterized as extra-legal conduct, not while there was still a chance the court would give him what he wanted. He'll wait to see what the hearing produces. And if the hearing produces what Alderman thinks it will? She looked at the road where the wagon had turned around and was moving back toward town. "Then Harold will have run out of mechanisms," she said. The hearing in Cheyenne was on a Tuesday, and Evelyn remembered it afterward not as a single event, but as a series of distinct moments that she carried with her. She remembered the courtroom, which was smaller than she expected and smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the particular institutional smell of rooms where official things were decided. She remembered Alderman, who was a compact, methodical man in his 50s who had the quality of a person who had been underestimated often enough to have learned to use it. She remembered the attorney representing Harold's interests, a man named Clifton from an Eastern firm, who was skilled and polished and had clearly been told this would be uncomplicated. She remembered the moment Clifton first saw Clara sitting in the room and recalibrated, visibly, his assessment of the situation. The hearing took 4 hours. She was asked to speak. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, the way she had learned to speak in Harold's house, when embellishment was used against her as evidence of hysteria. She gave dates. She gave names. She gave the specific sequence of events in the specific order they had occurred. Clifton cross-examined her with the specific technique of trying to find inconsistencies in a chronology. And there were no inconsistencies, because she had spent 4 years in a room building this account until it was solid all the way through, Clara testified, in the particular direct, unadorned way of a woman who had written things down as they happened because she knew even then that the truth would need to be demonstrable rather than simply believed. Clara went through the notebook entry by entry, and Clifton did not cross-examine her extensively because there was nothing in the notebook he could effectively challenge. Hale submitted his written account and did not appear in person, which Alderman had advised, since his appearance would have raised questions that were better left for a separate proceeding. Whitmore's written recantation was entered into the record. Burris's geological assessment was entered into the record. The survey with HH in the corner was entered into the record. Harold Harper's original correspondence, which Hale had delivered, naming names and describing intentions and establishing the deliberate nature of everything that had been done, was entered into the record. Clifton made his arguments. They were the arguments of a skilled attorney working with a case that had been undermined at its foundation, and they sounded increasingly like someone describing an architecture that was no longer standing. The judge, a woman named Evelyn, did not expect a woman, and later thought that this was itself a kind of lesson about what she had assumed about who held authority in the world, was called Judge Miriam Aldis. She was in her 60s, with gray hair and a manner so neutral it was almost geological. She listened to everything. She read the documents she was given with visible attention. She asked 3 questions of Alderman and 2 of Clifton and 1 of Evelyn directly, which was, "Is there anything you wish to add to your account that has not already been entered into the record?" Evelyn looked at the judge. She thought about what to say. She thought about 4 years in a room and the dried lavender in her coat pocket, and Caleb's voice saying, "That's my mama," on a platform in October, and Silas's hand on hers across the kitchen table. "No," she said. "The record is complete." Judge Aldous looked at her for a moment. Something in her face, not warmth exactly, more the acknowledgement of one person by another across a space, shifted fractionally. "Very well," she said. She ruled 2 hours later. The competency declarations issued by the Comstock Court were voided in their entirety on the grounds that the issuing judge had operated outside his proper jurisdiction and in conflict with documented evidence. The marriage to Reginald Voss, contracted under legal duress and over the subject's formal objection, was declared void ab initio, void from its beginning, as if it had never existed. Evelyn Marion Harper was declared to be of full legal competence and personal liberty, with no basis for guardianship in any jurisdiction. The federal order for her return to Harold Harper's custody was dismissed. The property claim on the Boone Ranch boundary strip, filed on behalf of an Eastern interest through Douglas Hale's office, was referred to the Territorial Attorney General for review on grounds of potential fraud. Harold James Harper was identified in the record as a subject of interest in multiple legal proceedings in Pennsylvania that had been ongoing, and that the ruling in this matter would be forwarded to support. Clifton sat very still during the reading of the ruling. He was a professional man, and professionals in his position did not show what they were feeling in a courtroom. But she watched his hands on the table, and his hands were very still, which was its own kind of telling. Alderman shook Silas's hand and then Evelyn's and said, with professional understatement, that he thought the outcome was satisfactory. Martha Greer, who was sitting 3 rows back with 2 other women from Caldwell Creek, exhaled so audibly that the man in front of her turned around. Silas reached over and took Evelyn's hand. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. There was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already being said by the specific weight of his hand on hers in a room where a woman named Miriam Aldous had just, officially and on record, given back what had been taken. Harold was arrested in Philadelphia 11 days after the hearing, on charges that included conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal confinement, and abuse of legal process. Dr. Whitmore surrendered his medical license. Judge Comstock, who had been under review for 18 months, resigned from the bench the same week and was subsequently charged with 6 counts of judicial misconduct related to Harper's cases and several others. Evelyn learned about the arrest through a wire from Alderman that arrived on a December morning when she was in the kitchen making breakfast, and Caleb was at the table arguing with himself about a mathematics problem in his reader. She stood with the wire in her hand for a moment. "Mama?" Caleb said. He had been calling her that for 3 weeks now, with the same matter-of-fact commitment he brought to most things once he had decided on them. "What is it?" She set the wire on the table. "News from Philadelphia," she said. He looked at the wire and then at her face. "Good news or bad news?" She thought about Harold in his beautiful house on Chestnut Street, in the study where he had explained to her, multiple times and with complete confidence, that he was doing what was best for her, that she did not understand her own circumstances, that the arrangements he had made were in her interest because he had determined what her interest was. She thought about the room on the 2nd floor with the lock that only opened from the outside. "Good news," she said. Caleb nodded and went back to his mathematics. Silas came in from outside, bringing the cold with him, and stamped his boots at the door and looked at the wire on the table. "Alderman," he said, "Harold was arrested." He stood at the door and looked at her, a long look. "It's done," he said. "Yes." He came to the table and sat down and read the wire. And then he sat for a while with it in his hands, and she put a cup of coffee in front of him, and he picked it up, and she sat across from him, and neither of them said anything for a while. And that was all right. There were things you did not need to say out loud to know you had said them. Caleb looked up from his reader. "Can I have breakfast now?" "Yes," they both said, at the same time, and looked at each other. And it was not a perfect moment. Caleb immediately knocked his cup off the table, and the morning was very cold and the mathematics problem remained unsolved. But it was real, entirely and without ornamentation real, and that was all it needed to be. They married in February when the Wyoming winter was still fully itself. No concession to spring, no softening, just the cold, honest facts of the season. and they did it in the yard of the ranch rather than in town, because Silas said he'd had enough of the town watching them for a while, and Evelyn agreed without argument. It was not an elaborate wedding. Martha Greer came, and Hector Daniels, and Pete, and two neighboring families who had stood at the gate on Sunday and needed no other reason to be invited. Clara was there, which meant it was complete. Caleb was the one who decided the ceremony needed flowers, and since there were no flowers in February in Wyoming, he spent 2 days creating them from colored paper with a focus and seriousness that indicated he considered this an engineering problem rather than an art project. He produced 14 paper flowers of varying accuracy and arranged them on the porch railing with the specific satisfaction of a person who has identified a problem and solved it. Judge Aldis had offered to perform the ceremony via a colleague in Cheyenne, but Warwick held a Justice of the Peace Commission and did it instead, which was more in keeping with everything. Warwick read the words in his matter-of-fact manner, and Silas said what he needed to say in the direct way he said things, and Evelyn said what she needed to say, and it was cold, and someone's horse made a noise at the wrong moment, and Clara cried, which she would have strongly denied if anyone had mentioned it. Caleb stood beside Silas throughout, taking his role with extreme gravity, and at the moment that Warwick said the words that made it official, he nodded once. The same nod he had given on the platform in October, the nod of a person confirming information they had already accepted as true, and then looked at the paper flowers on the railing with the critical eye of an artist, assessing his own work, and apparently found them satisfactory. What Harold Harper's scheme had failed to account for was something that no scheme ever accounts for, because it cannot be quantified or anticipated or turned into leverage, the specific human texture of a place that has decided to hold something together. He had counted on distance, on a man isolated by grief and alone with a young child, and a struggling ranch being susceptible to sustained pressure, on a woman contained and controlled and eventually, through legal and physical force, brought back into a structure he managed. He had counted on the impersonal machinery of law and money working in his favor, as it had worked in his favor his entire life, because he had learned to trust systems and forgotten that systems are only reliable when the people inside them are not paying attention. The people of Caldwell Creek had been paying attention, not all of them, and not always in the right direction, and not without a period of confusion and misjudgment. Martha Greer had taken her time. Hector Daniels had put a document in his files and not thought about it for 2 years. Warwick had needed to be briefed before he could act. These were not heroes. They were people who, given sufficient information and sufficient time to decide, had chosen to do the harder and more honest thing rather than the convenient one. That distinction mattered, even if it was not spectacular. What Harold also had not accounted for was Clara, who was not a dramatic person and was not a heroic person in any way she would have claimed, but who had kept a notebook under a pantry floor for 4 years because she had understood, practically, and without sentiment, that the truth required a record if it was going to matter. And he had not accounted for Evelyn herself, which was his oldest and most consistent failure. He had never been able to account for her because he had never been able to accurately assess her. He had seen a daughter, and then an asset, and then a problem, and never once, in all the years he had managed her and contained her and arranged her, had he seen what was actually there, a woman who had been quietly in the interior of a locked room, building the case that would unmake him. She had told herself in that room that she needed to survive for Caleb. That was true. She had told herself she needed to survive for Silas. That was also true. But underneath both of those, she had told herself something else. In the dark of early morning, when the lavender in her pocket was all she had of the life she was going to get back. I will not be what he made of me. I will be what I am. What she was, as it turned out, was someone who fixed fence wrong until a 5-year-old corrected her, who made coffee before anyone asked, who kept county records in her coat pocket, who did not perform strength but exercised it without announcement. Not a symbol, not a lesson, just a woman who had held on to herself through conditions designed to make her let go, and had found, on the other side of it, that what she'd held on to was worth the holding. By the following spring, the Boone Ranch had a second fence line along the north boundary that Silas and Evelyn built together. Not because it was urgent, but because the process of building something with your hands alongside another person was its own kind of conversation, the kind that didn't require words to communicate the things it was communicating. Caleb helped. He was genuinely useful with fence by now, having taken the matter of his own competence seriously since approximately the age of 2 months, by his own accounting. He explained to Evelyn, multiple times, the correct tension technique. She let him explain it multiple times. It didn't stop being useful. Clara came back in April and stayed for 3 weeks and argued good-naturedly with Pete about the organization of the tack room, and won. She left with an open invitation to return whenever she wished, which she exercised twice a year for the rest of the time she was healthy enough to travel. The mineral rights question was eventually resolved in Silas's favor, which meant that the silver in the ground under the north boundary strip was his to develop or not develop as he chose. He chose, for the first years, not to develop it. The ranch was doing well, and he did not want the disruption of extraction operations on land he had spent years working to establish. Later, when Caleb was old enough to have opinions about it, they discussed it at the kitchen table the way they discussed most things, and Caleb, who had by then developed a thorough and academically supported interest in engineering, had extensive opinions about the most efficient method of extraction, and the discussion lasted 2 evenings, and they made a decision together. That was the nature of it, as it turned out. Not a house with a locked door, not a room with a lock on the outside, a kitchen table with coffee on it, and people who told each other the truth even when the truth was complicated, and a boy who grew up understanding that the things that mattered were decided by the people they mattered to, together, imperfectly, and with full knowledge that imperfectly was the only way humans had ever actually done anything that lasted. Years later, Evelyn stood on the porch on a November evening. November again, always November in Wyoming, that month of stripped-back honesty when the landscape stopped pretending it was anything other than what it was, and watched the light go off the range. Silas came out and stood beside her with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, which was how he communicated certain things that he did not otherwise communicate, and they stood there for a while without talking. Inside, someone was moving around the kitchen, not Caleb. Caleb had his own house on the adjacent property now, the one he'd built over 2 summers with a thoroughness that had caused Pete to remark that the boy had finally found something worth being obsessive about, and Pete had been right. It was Caleb's wife, a woman named Nora, who was from Texas and had opinions about organization that were, in Evelyn's assessment, entirely correct, and who had a laugh that you could hear from 3 rooms away, which was one of the many reasons Caleb had married her. There were grandchildren, eventually. 2 of them Caleb's and 1 of them belonging to Pete, who had married late and joyfully, and whose daughter had an absolute conviction that any problem could be solved by persistence and proximity that was so specifically her father's quality that it made Evelyn smile every time she saw it. The ranch had become something. Not a symbol, not a landmark, just a working piece of a larger community. The kind of place that people knew was there and was solid. The kind of operation that helped neighbors when they needed it, and expected help in return when it was needed. The ordinary, uncelebrated infrastructure of a place that held together because the people in it had decided it was worth holding. She thought about the train platform, about the town looking at their boots, about a small boy breaking free from the crowd with his arms out, running toward a stranger in a ruined dress, certain of something the rest of the crowd had not yet caught up to. There were things you did not choose, the conditions you were born into, the power other people claimed over you, the room with the lock on the outside. There were things you could not prevent. There were years that were stolen from you by other people's greed and other people's certainty that they had the right to manage what wasn't theirs to manage. And there were things that were yours regardless, what you kept hold of when everything was taken, what you built when you got back, who you became in the space between what had been done to you and what you chose to do next. She had not been a perfect wife or a perfect mother or a perfect anything, and she had stopped expecting perfection from herself around the time she started repairing fence in borrowed trousers in November cold with blistered hands. Perfection was not the point. The point was the work, the presence, the ongoing daily decision to show up for the people you had claimed and the life you had chosen. "What are you thinking about?" Silas said. She considered the question. He had been asking it for years, and she had learned that he asked it not because he needed an answer, but because he had learned somewhere along the way that the question itself was a way of saying, "You are here, and I am paying attention." "October," she said. "The platform." He was quiet for a moment. "You look terrible," he said. "I know. I didn't know what to do." "I know that too." He drank his coffee. The light off the range was going amber and then going, and the cold was settling in the way it did. And somewhere inside the house, Nora said something and laughed at her own joke, which was a thing Nora did that was entirely charming. "I'm glad you came back," Silas said. It was not what she had expected him to say. After all the years and all the things that had been said between them, she had not expected those particular words in that particular order, and the fact that they still landed, still hit something in her chest that was old and permanent and real, told her something she had known, but sometimes forgot, that you did not outlast feeling. You did not grow past it, or build over it, or arrive at some elevation where it no longer reached you. You just got better at carrying it, and better at recognizing it for what it was, which was evidence of the only thing that had actually mattered through all of it. "I never really left," she said. "I was just very far away." He looked at her in the way he had been looking at her for years, steady and direct, and with that residue of the man who had once built walls so well he almost convinced himself they were load-bearing. And then he looked back at the range. The light was almost gone. Inside, the house was warm. The frightened woman who had stepped off a train with nothing but a sealed letter and a body that had been through too much had built something. Not because she was special, not because her story was extraordinary in the way stories are sometimes required to be, but because she had refused, in the specific interior way that no one could touch, to be what was done to her. She had held on to what she was, in a room with a lock on the outside, until she got back to the place where it mattered, and the place it held. That was the whole of it. That was the thing she would have told anyone who asked, if anyone had asked. Not that the good prevailed because it deserved to, not that justice was guaranteed, not that love conquered everything, because none of those things were reliable enough to be the lesson. Just this. Hold on to what you are. Get back when you can. Build what's worth building with the people who are worth building it with. Everything else follows from that, or it doesn't, but you will have been yourself through it, and that, in the end, in the cold, on a Wyoming porch with a cup of coffee and the sound of your family inside the house behind you, is more than enough.